John, go ahead.
Good morning, everyone. On behalf of the American Geographical Society Council, our members, and the staff, it's my pleasure to welcome you to the first of our Location Tech Task Force Blue Ribbon panels. To those of you participating in the conversation on WebEx, those that are watching our live stream on Facebook, it's great to have you joining us this morning. We are proud to partner our EthicalGEO initiative with the Henry Luce Foundation to investigate societal implications of geospatial technology and location tracking. Mobile location-based applications have become ubiquitous in our society. As all of you know, they have changed the way we live our lives in a very short period of time. There are, however, problematic and unanticipated effects of using this technology. To better understand the ethical implications of its use, we have provided this platform to frame the discussion and to address these issues as they are already impacting our lives on a daily basis. COVID-19 has put a spotlight on the concept of using mobile tracing and surveillance to fight the pandemic. Around the world, the utilization of this technology to fight the coronavirus is being employed to various degrees, and already governments and people worldwide are faced with the issue of compromised privacy and what that means as we go forward. Over the next couple of months, we will convene several blue ribbon panels and leadership spotlights of recognized experts with varied perspectives to participate in this discussion. Today, we are going to focus on the international perspectives of vulnerable publics. Before we move on, I would like to explain to those of you on our WebEx platform the best way to get the most out of today's panel. For those viewing on desktop computers or laptops, we recommend that you customize your viewing by hovering the mouse in the top right of your screen and selecting the icon in the middle. During our Q&A session later, to ask a question, hover your mouse under the arrow and click on the question mark icon in the gray bar at the bottom of the screen. For those of you using a tablet or mobile device, select the icon with the 3 dots, which will then allow you to select the question mark icon to submit your questions to our panelists. And now, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Christopher Tucker, the chairman of AGS and our moderator for today's session. Chris, it's a pleasure to welcome you and your panel.
Thank you, John. I too would like to thank our panelists for joining us today. I'd like to thank our team for arranging all this, and I'd like to thank all of you who have registered for both our WebEx and have clicked on our Facebook live stream. We appreciate you taking the morning today to discuss what we believe is one of the most pressing issues facing our global society in the face of COVID-19. We at the AGS have been convening government, industry, academia, and the social sector for the past 169 years around the vital issues of the day through a geographic lens. And because of the generous support of the Henry Luce Foundation, we've been able to convene today a set of experts who can shed light on the international experience in the face of COVID-19 with location tracking, contact tracing technologies, and in some cases, not just international, but transnational. And we've been fortunate to get together a series of world-leading experts that you'll be able to enjoy this morning and ask your questions to. And it is my pleasure to be able to introduce them. So I'll read some short bios before we get started. Mr. Mark Bromley helped launch the Council for Global Equality to encourage a clearer and stronger American voice on international LGBT and intersex human rights concerns. In 2016, he provided the first ever testimony to the House Foreign Affairs Committee on the state of LGBT rights around the world. Today, Mr. Bromley and his colleagues provide regular briefings on trends impacting LGBT individuals globally. He also monitors the UN human rights systems and has conducted research on sexual violence as a war crime. Mr. Steve Feldman, incoming senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, Steve has served as Deputy Assistant Secretary in the U.S. Department of State, where he had responsibility for Africa policy, international labor affairs, and international religious freedom. Previously, he was director of the Office of Policy at the at USAID, and also served as counsel on the U.S. Senate Committee on Foreign Relations, where he oversaw U.S. foreign assistance programs and international organizations. Mr. Mustafa Kadri is founder and executive director of Equidem Research and Consulting. He is a human rights research and advocacy expert with over 15 years of experience in government and public international law, journalism, and the non-governmental sector. He is the author of several landmark human rights reports into the construction industry, civil and political rights issues, and media freedom, and has carried out human rights investigations in several countries. Ms. Vani Saraswati is associate editor and strategic advisor of migrantrights.org, a Gulf-based NGO that amplifies the voices and experiences of low-income migrant workers in the Gulf and wider Middle East region. And Mr. Andrew Young is knowledge director at the GovLab, where he leads research efforts focusing on the impact of technology and public institutions. He has authored or co-authored a number of extended works on new approaches for improving governance with technology. He is also the network coordinator of the GovLab chaired MacArthur Foundation Research Network on Opening Governance. For those of you from the geospatial industry, you'll note that none of these people are actually experts in location technology. And that for one reason is why we selected all of them, for their diverse perspectives on how this class of technology can affect vulnerable publics around the world, internationally and transnationally. So I'd like to first hand over to our first speaker, Mr. Mark Bromley, for his presentation today. Mark.
Great, thank you, Chris. And let me just emphasize that I am not an expert in technology. My two elementary school children understand how my cell phone works better than I do. But you know, we do have some real concerns about contact tracing in the context of LGBTI individuals, particularly in the countries that continue to criminalize same-sex relationships and intimacy. So with that, I'll go ahead and just offer a few initial observations and concerns, and then I look forward to the conversation. First slide, please. Oh, and apologies, I think the first slide just introduces my organization, Council for Global Equality. We are a Washington human rights advocacy organization. We're a coalition of 30 member organizations. We combine most of the US-based international human rights organizations, as well as the US LGBT civil rights organizations, one of the leading intersex organizations, and together our coalition works with the US government and pushes the US government to adopt human rights policies that respond to the unique challenges facing LGBTI communities around the world. So with that, if we could go to the first slide, or the next slide, please. Great, so my concerns or comments today are really going to be centered around the 70 or so countries that continue to criminalize same-sex relationships and intimacy. So in these criminalized contexts, individuals who are LGBTI or gender nonconforming are obviously at significant risk, both of criminal sanction, but also of societal discrimination, violence, and quite often entrapment is a real concern in these criminalizing countries. So in that context, I have some real concerns about how contact tracing can be affected and how it will affect LGBTI individuals. Next slide, please. So just some initial concerns, right? I have some real concerns about governments in these criminalizing countries. I think in particular right now of a country like Egypt, which is probably the country on the planet that is most active in hunting down and prosecuting individuals who are suspected of being gay or transgender. So countries like that, I'm really worried about the government having access to social networks. So think of an LGBTI person who is COVID positive, and then the government has access to that individual's social network. A government that is actively hunting down and arresting and prosecuting and persecuting LGBTI individuals, for that government to have access to that person's network is quite concerning. But I'm also worried about hackers having access to that network, right? So we see in these criminalizing countries, in the 70 or so countries that criminalize, there really are a dozen to 20 countries that are actively prosecuting individuals. But even in the countries that aren't sort of actively trying to find and prosecute gay, lesbian, transgender people, in those countries, we often see that the police and outside agents are trying to harass and extort, seek bribes from individuals who are suspected of being gay or lesbian or trans. So I worry not only about the government having access to this, but hackers or app designers having access to this and using that information to chart social networks. I'm also worried about what happens if an LGBT person is forced to shelter in place, probably with their family. And we know that in these criminalizing contexts and in many other contexts, families are often not accepting of LGBTI identities, and that individuals are actually subject to significant violence at home if they come out or are perceived to be LGBTI. And so if you're sheltering in place and the government has access to information saying that you're leaving your home when you shouldn't be, it can actually be a death sentence if individuals who are facing violence or discrimination at home or wherever they're sheltering in place are too afraid to leave because the government will know they're leaving when they're not supposed to. That concerns me as well. I also worry about the government sort of triangulating and using information they find from LGBTI individuals who test COVID positive to figure out where they're hanging out, right? What are the safe places they go to? Where are almost every criminalizing country has underground LGBTI organizations that are supporting the community. And they're supporting the community often with safe spaces where people can go and meet each other, can seek help and assistance and community. So if the government suddenly has access and can figure out where these safe spaces are or where people are meeting, that could be dangerous as well. And finally, you know, there was an example from Korea this past May where we see that the government's use of this sort of data in an LGBTI context can actually drive LGBTI people away from health professionals, can drive them out of the system because they're afraid of being identified. So as some of you may have seen, back in May, there was a hotspot within the neighborhood that has some of the gay bars in Seoul, South Korea. The government was able to figure out through cell phone data, through credit card purchases, they came up with a list of about 1,500 people who had been in those establishments. And they told them they had to come forward and get tested. But folks, because of the stigma, were reluctant to come forward. The government started publishing information, not their identities, but started publishing information that started to identify groups of people, and that just drove the community underground. It really, I think, is a cautionary tale in terms of how not to use that information in response to a public health crisis. Next slide, please. I'll go through these next slides quickly because I do want to get to conversation. So potential misuse of data. I'm worried about security agents and hackers using this information for blackmail. We've seen that very situation play out in social networking apps that bring LGBTI people together around the world, where governments, I think of Egypt in particular, have been able to get into the system and figure out using geolocation where people are and also entrap people using that information. I'm worried about again, the use of this information to raid safe spaces. Also, we've seen some interesting problems for transgender people around COVID, where in some countries, Panama and Peru, we've seen some real problems where the countries have decided that that during sheltering in place, people can only go out of their homes on certain days in order to go shopping or go to the pharmacy. And transgender people in Panama in particular have had challenges with that, because no matter which day they go out on, they've been harassed by the police because they're not allowed to change their gender marker on their identity documents. So if they don't match their gender marker, or if they seem to be gender nonconforming or transgender, they've been harassed and they don't go out. Well, if the government then has access to your movements and knows that you're going out on a day that you shouldn't be going out because the government registry says you're male or female and you're not going out on the male or female day, then the government suddenly has access to your transgender identity. And in many countries, cross-dressing and other crimes are used. There are cross-dressing laws that are used to prosecute transgender people. So again, there's this concern of how that data is being used. And the reality is, in terms of sex work, many transgender people in parts of the world have few opportunities and do often have to turn to survival sex work. And so in that context, if the government suddenly has access to your location and to your social network, they can use that as a means of going after those that you've been engaged with. And often governments assume that transgender people are sex workers, even if they're not. So they may use those same laws to target everyone in your social network, whether or not you're engaged in transactional sex work. Okay, next slide, please. So a lot of this comes from our decades of experience and investments through PEPFAR, the US Global AIDS Program, our global investments to address HIV, and particularly our work with key populations, particularly men who have sex with men and transgender people, to address HIV/AIDS around the world. There are obviously some differences between HIV and COVID. HIV is not spread through casual contact, so the stigma of being associated with somebody who's COVID positive as opposed to somebody who had HIV is obviously a little bit different, but I think there are some important similarities. Next slide, please. So over the past 2 years, PEPFAR has focused significantly on contact tracing, what they call index testing, but it's essentially the same thing. And as we've seen PEPFAR programs in different countries ramp up with index testing, particularly as that relates to LGBTI individuals, we've seen a couple of real vulnerabilities. We've seen a lot of privacy violations. So the index tracers, or those essentially in the COVID context who are doing contact tracing, they have to be trained and sensitive to the vulnerabilities faced by LGBTI individuals. And in the PEPFAR HIV context, we've seen that those contact tracers or index testers in the PEPFAR world often have exposed people's LGBTI status. There have been significant privacy violations and discrimination in the actual treatment of individuals once they figure out that they're LGBTI. This has undermined some of the public health messages and priorities, particularly trying to get people in for testing and treatment in these at-risk communities. As the contact tracing has progressed and individuals, partners and families are notified of potential exposure, we've seen a real uptick in violence, sexual and gender-based violence against those individuals. Individuals through this process have been exposed to arrest and persecution, and often accused, again, of sex work. So the lessons from the PEPFAR world are very real, I think, in this context. Next slide, please. Finally, I just say that while HIV and COVID are different pandemics, and the transmission obviously has different implications, there's one real similarity. In the case of LGBTI individuals, the impact of incarceration, if the government does use this information to find you and arrest you because you're LGBTI, the impact is deadly. We know that LGBTI individuals, because they often in these countries are living at the margins of society, are less healthy than the average person and are more susceptible to significant impact from COVID. So that's also the case with HIV, of course. So incarceration is deadly for LGBTI people in any context. They're exposed to extreme violence, often sexual torture in prison. But adding that to the mix of COVID is really an absolute public health disaster. So those are my initial thoughts, and I look forward to the conversation.
Mark, thanks so much. I appreciate not only did you talk about the impacts of mobile location technologies on the LGBTI community internationally, but you actually gave us a nice little geography lesson about the parts of the world where we really need to learn those lessons and train a keen eye to look out for the rights of our LGBTQI friends. So thank you for that. Next, I'd like to move to Steve Feldman from Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Steve.
Great. Thank you for having me. I appreciate the opportunity to participate in this panel. It's really a set of issues that I've thought long and hard about in terms of my research in recent years. So I have spent a considerable time looking at the proliferation of digital technology and its use by democratic leaders and regimes, as well as democracies, to advance political objectives. I have a forthcoming book that examines trends across 5 different dimensions, from surveillance, online censorship, and disinformation, to internet shutdowns and arrests of online users, that really compares political strategies and levels of digital repression between autocracies and democracies. So what I want to do today is to talk about why these technologies generally present threats to vulnerable populations, and make the argument that invasive surveillance techniques augmented by the COVID-19 pandemic, including but not limited to location monitoring apps and devices, provide powerful capabilities to governments to exploit and repress vulnerable populations. So to understand how vulnerable publics are affected by new digital technologies, particularly advanced surveillance methods such as location monitoring, I think it's first useful to lay out a broader context and look at 3 issues: authoritarian resurgence worldwide, the subsequent impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, and then to focus in on a few countries of highest concern. So I think there are 2 overall global trends related to the rise of digital technology and its political use. I think one is the geopolitical tensions on the rise in the United States and China. Now, the countries represent different tech values and norms, and its effect on vulnerable publics and the protection of broader human rights principles separates to a large degree. You see in the tech space significant tech geoeconomic competition between different social media platforms, between 5G network competition and so forth, but you also see a normative competition where you really have a competition between the US, China, and others to implement preferred norms for technology, preferred standards in international forums, from the ITU to others. And then you also have a global information struggle taking place as well to define and identify how these technologies will work. And this is everything from surveillance and censorship to disinformation campaigns. So what this, in many respects, echoes is an autocratic resurgence. If we can turn to the first slide. Or rather, I should say, this then feeds into the second trend globally, which is an autocratic resurgence. So what you can see in the slide. Let's go back to the first one. Yeah, great. Is that over here, this lists 6 countries that were the highest autocratizing countries in the looking back for 10 years. This sort of illustrates the trend in terms of autocratic resurgence. Essentially what this is, and when you think about the term autocratization, is the opposite process of democratization, where citizens in these countries are increasingly living under constraints when it comes to their political freedoms. And so there are a range of countries in here. Certainly some of the countries are not a surprise, Nicaragua, Turkey being at the top in terms of the largest levels of rates of autocratization. But if you look at the bottom, you can see the United States is actually among this list. Other countries that would be less expected. And so what this shows is that not only do we generally see a broader trend towards authoritarian resurgence, but you see specific countries such as these where you have high prevalence rates of autocratization. And what that means is when you combine the rise of digital technology and look at the exacerbating effects of COVID-19, you have a real crisis at hand. So what does that then mean about COVID-19? How should we think about COVID-19 within this context of authoritarian resurgence? So my general belief with COVID-19 is that not that it's necessarily transformative so far in terms of what it's changing politically, but that it is accelerating existing patterns and scrambling assumptions when it comes to politics in these countries. And I would look at 4 insights related to COVID-19's impact. First, as I mentioned, it's accelerating repressive patterns in countries that already have pre-existing levels of repression. Second, because states have become central in gathering and providing information, particularly as lockdowns continue and citizens are resort to using online methods in which to communicate. Third, you see the rise of digital technology in response to coronavirus and corresponding concerns is not an authoritarian problem, so that you see these tools being used by many governments which are democratic, such as Poland, Serbia, Brazil, India, South Africa, and so forth. And so it's a problem that is shared across political regimes. And then fourth, you see new surveillance techniques, including location monitoring, contact tracing, and so forth, are coming online in an ad hoc manner without proper vetting or oversight. So clear rules of the road in terms of how these applications will be used, use of data, privacy protections, let alone redress for misuse, have either not been thought out or have been deliberately overlooked. And that has significant concerns when it comes to its implications. So what are the surveillance implications of COVID-19 particularly? Really, I think there are a couple areas of emphasis. One is the use of aggregated and anonymized data for virus tracking. But the second, the use of individual location data for contact tracing. So data volunteered either with user consent or compelled by a government entity. Now, some of these surveillance measures are justified. Some measures fall into the murky middles, but many measures are thin excuses for autocratic leaders to enact greater controls on the population. And we know that contact tracing apps are being used in 28 countries around the world at a minimum, that alternative digital tracking measures such as aggregated mobile data, location data to track citizens during lockdowns are being used in 35 countries around the world. And we know that physical surveillance technology specifically linked to COVID-19 are in use in 11 countries, including facial recognition cameras, surveillance drones, and extensive CCTV networks. So what are the implications then for specific countries, and where should we be most concerned? A starting question is to say, where are pandemic violations most prevalent? If I worked off data from the Varieties of Democracy Project to initially establish a baseline of where are pandemic violations occurring across the world. So let's go turn to slide 2. The next slide. Yeah, great. Okay, so it shows you here. I know it's an AGS event, so I wanted to make sure that I was respectful of the geographical component. This tells us where pandemic violations may generally be occurring, but it doesn't provide more granular data about where digital tech violations linked to surveillance may be prevalent. But it does give you a nice, at least overall sense of where you see emergency orders that have been implemented that lead to troubling violations of rights. And it crosses a number of different countries. Obviously, some of the countries listed are autocratic in nature, like China and so forth. But you also see countries like India that are very much up there as well, which for those of us kind of watching India's illiberal trajectory may not come as much of a surprise. So what I wanted to do was I wanted to take this general baseline and then add a technology overlay, a digital repression overlay. So essentially to sort of say, if you combine countries that had a pre-existing level of digital repression by their governments together with those that have a baseline level of pandemic violations, which countries would, what would that look like? So next slide, please. So this is where this is the combination of the two, and so essentially I've quantitatively scored it, and so you can see there are some differences. A number of the countries that we've mentioned, that I've mentioned, like China, like India, Saudi Arabia, and others, squarely fall on this list as the country most prevalent concern. So let's actually break it down and look at the top 11 countries, because it's hard to sort of sometimes identify just by a map alone. So next slide, please. So here you have the top 11 countries, and I've put the composite score that's highlighted to the right. So countries that you might expect: Saudi Arabia, closed autocracy; Eritrea, China, Oman, Indonesia, somewhat of an outlier; the Philippines, an electoral autocracy that's descending pretty quickly under Duterte's rule; Sri Lanka, another country that with the recent elections is also displaying a troubling pattern; Venezuela, not a surprise; Egypt, which has been mentioned by Mark. And so, but this is kind of where I would sort of square 11 of the most concerning countries around the world as it relates to both the effects from COVID-19 as well as digital repression technology. Now, I know I'm running short of time, so I just want to finish with a couple points. First, when it comes to the issue of vulnerable publics, I think what's particularly important to recognize is that definition can really encompass a significant diversity of groups depending on the context and geographical area where you're looking at. So it can be traditionally marginalized ethnic groups such as Uyghurs in China, Rohingya in Myanmar, African American community in the United States. It can refer to other groups persecuted on different bases such as sexual orientation, gender, migrants. It can be political beliefs, so government critics in the Philippines, opposition challengers in Venezuela, leftists in Brazil, journalists in the Gulf states. In other words, it's a broad definition that is context dependent, but ultimately is strongly contingent on access to power. And so, within this kind of definitional framework and bearing in mind some of the data presented in terms of global trends and where we see violations occurring specifically, a few countries that maybe worth discussing in subsequent Q&A that I've kind of laid out some information would be China in terms of location tracking, particularly with regard to the Uyghur minority, but also that is now extended to the broader population and that is really meant to extend government political control. Saudi Arabia, where surveillance is a cornerstone to the country's repressive strategy, and where the government operates extensive systems to target regime critics, activists, and others voicing dissent. And then finally, India, where you see contact tracing apps that borrow elements from Chinese apps and that use Bluetooth signals combined with GPS location data to augment the information gathered and to build a centralized database about ostensibly stopping the spread of infection, but also that opens up large possibilities for abuse. So I will stop there and thank you again for the opportunity.
Steve, thank you. You taught me a new word. I've always paid attention to democratizing, but autocratizing is a new word for me. And, it hurts the brain to realize that many things are actually moving in that other direction and not, just slowly not democratizing. So no, thank you for those insights. We look forward to the larger Q&A with you. To the audience, remember the instructions to go into the WebEx Q&A function, and feel free, you can put in your questions now. And as we get to the later Q&A, we'll start to take those into account. So thank you, Steve. We'd like to move now on to Mr. Mustafa Kadri from Equidem Research and Consulting. Mustafa.
Thanks, Chris, and hi, everyone, whether it's morning or evening, afternoon, wherever you might be. Firstly, thank you to the American Geographical Society for inviting me to speak to you today, and it's really also a privilege to share this virtual stage with the other panelists, and already I've learned quite a bit from the panelists who have preceded me. So, this is a really timely discussion because, as we all know, we're more connected digitally than ever before. And like the other panelists have said, I'll say very openly, I am in no way a tech expert or a geographical expert, but there's no question in the work that I do as a human rights researcher and with my organization that those two issues, geography and technology, are really key. In terms of a very limited context as to who I am and what we do, so like I said, I run a human rights research organization. I've done investigations in a range of contexts, in conflict zones, in hard to reach areas. The obvious focus of our work is on marginalized and vulnerable populations. That could be minorities who are persecuted. It could be low wage workers. A big part of the work that we're currently doing is on low wage migrant workers in the Arab Gulf states. And as many of you will know, and as some speakers have already mentioned, the Gulf is a place of intense surveillance, and the tech aspect of that surveillance has been a feature of those societies for a very long time. One of the contexts to that is the fact that when you think about the Gulf states, you should think and know that these are societies that are firstly not democratic. Yes, there's a lot of political repression, but critically, these are also countries which are effectively run by a handful of families. These are effectively politically have a tribal social structure, and these are effectively kingdoms. And what that means is that these are also very vulnerable states because the power in those societies is very focused on a few key individuals. And so with in modern times technology having the capacity to really monitor what's happening in your society, these regimes have found it very useful to use that technology as well as a way of controlling society. The other thing is that many of the Gulf states are ones where the nationals of that country are actually a minority. So if you look at, say, Qatar or the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, in those countries, something between 70 to 90% of the population are foreigners, and the majority of those populations are low-wage workers. If you think about the societies where you might be in right now, where migration has become such a controversial and sensitive issue, and think about the levels of migration are much smaller in our countries than, say, in the Gulf, you can understand to an extent that there will be an inherent anxiety towards people coming from overseas and this fear of them sort of taking control of the society. So that's also a really important thing to really stress, which is to say that, yes, these are very, not very politically free societies, but also beyond the leadership, the populations have anxieties about foreigners. Now, one of the features, if you travel to the Gulf, somewhere like Dubai or Doha, Manama, these international capitals, is the moment you arrive in the country, you'll have your biometric data captured straight away. You have a video taken of you, often your fingerprints are taken. There are cameras all across these very modern, flashy airports that you might visit. And one of the features of these states is that for the moment that you enter the country and the moment you leave the country, most, if not all, of your movements will be documented in some way. And what many of these states have managed to do is effectively capture virtually everyone in that society. So before coronavirus hits the world and it hits the Gulf region, they already had a very developed architecture and systems to really check on what people are doing. Because the Gulf states have a lot of fossil fuel economies, very wealthy societies historically, obviously that's being challenged of late with the drop in the oil price, but these are historically, in the last 20 years, quite wealthy societies. They've also been able to bring in private support on surveillance and intelligence from a range of actors so that often they can have a very sophisticated way of tracking people. And so what we see with anyone in these societies, even political dissidents, people who are not low-wage workers, is that these states make a lot of effort to be tracking not just their physical movements, but also people's phones, their laptops. Under the laws of all these societies, a lot of political expression is completely prohibited. Not in all, but in many of the societies like Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, it's unlawful or illegal to form or join a union, to collectively bargain, or to peacefully protest in that society. So in fact, people who have spoken about what would seem to be very mundane issues, such as the right of women to drive or the demand to have parliamentary elections, have actually been put in jail. And those of us who visit the region or who may be outside and are in contact with locals a lot have discovered that in fact these states will often even seek to do surveillance on activists who are in contact with people in those countries. So you're talking about a situation where there was intense surveillance and a very sophisticated, developed technological response to any kind of political dissent for a very long period of time. And then what happens is the coronavirus hits the region as it has in every part of the planet. And these societies and these governments really panic because they're concerned about their vulnerability, because these are ultimately, if you look at the map of the region, it is mostly a desert region. So the predominant populations are in urban centers. Urban centers have particular vulnerabilities when it comes to infection. And you have lots of, literally millions of low-wage migrant workers who are living in medium to high density accommodation, typically 4 or more people, mostly men, living in one room. So this is, literally like a place that's ideal for infection of the pandemic. And so we see with these states, the response is firstly to restrict the movement of these workers, but to very quickly also unload apps for mobile phones and other technology that is around tracking the spread of the infection. And so what that means is what we have discovered through human rights research, community of human rights researchers who work on the Gulf, is that practically all these apps that are used in the region in some way are being used to either simply surveil people to track where they're going, or actually even go beyond that and to actually hack people's phones to obtain information on there. And workers are not immune to that. Whilst a big amount of the energy is spent on political activists, what we also find is that workers who might seek to organize, for example, they may complain about the lack of pay for several months and then they might protest or go on strike. These apps are being used to basically locate the leaders of those strikes or those complaints to prosecute or criminalize them or even remove them from the country. And so immediately, as soon as coronavirus hits, the same tendencies that were always there are used but are exacerbated. And this new technology is applied. And also the governments very clearly state that it's illegal to not download these apps. So you have to have this technology in your phone. Now, of course, technology and things like tracing apps for coronavirus do have a place in responding to this, really unprecedented pandemic situation. There's no question about that. And there are many ways in which these apps are very useful. So, of course, we don't want to ignore that as well. But the issue is that when you are dealing with a region where there is no, for example, parliamentary structures, except for in Kuwait of the Gulf countries, there is very little oversight as to how these technologies are being applied. And what that means as well is that a small group of people is free to make decisions about how to use this technology without really needing to justify its use or to really test out its efficacy from an ethical standpoint. And so this really leads us to a situation where we're concerned as human rights activists that even as the pandemic hopefully reduces over time or there's a vaccine, that these apps are here to stay, that these regimes will continue to insist that people apply those apps. And the concern particularly with the typical low-wage migrant worker is whereas a local who is an activist or a foreigner, a migrant worker from a developed country might have a degree of prominence if something happens to them, these low-wage workers from Kenya or India or other emerging economies, really, these are invisible people naturally in the society. So when things happen to them, even if they're actually, for example, organizing workers to complain peacefully about the situation, very little might be known about how they're treated. And that's something that we're seeing quite a bit of. And that leads me to, one of the key things to really take away, which is to say that, in fact, technology is not the enemy. Technology does not need to be something that we're frightened of. In fact, it's something that can unlock all sorts of access, particularly for marginalized people. If you are a woman, if you are a worker who's informally employed, not in the correct visa category, being able to use your WhatsApp or social media to access your friends, speak to a doctor, see how your family back home is really powerful. The governments in this region have also used it as a social media and this technology as a way of providing information about how to prevent infection, what is coronavirus, and that's very positive. But what we also see is that when people are in a situation of marginalization, meaning that they're low-wage workers, they're informally employed, in some way they slip through the cracks of the system, they are very reluctant to reveal themselves and even use technology, even in situations where they need help. And that has a very practical negative implication. And that is obviously, for example, that if people have the infection, they are, less likely to actually tell people about it. They actually might be an infection risk, and yet they're worried that the moment that they come out, that they might be prosecuted, or even simply that the way that they're treated in isolation wards in hospitals will be, really unpleasant, and they might face exploitation. And so I think that is a really key thing that we really need to look at. And with the work that we do at Equidem, we're not just about documenting problems, we're really about solutions as well. And I think that's something that I hope today as well we can think about as well, is that there are profound challenges, but we have to also think, what are the solutions? And I would argue that, in these very challenging spaces, such as in the Gulf, those issues aren't just limited to societies which are autocratic or there's a lack of freedom. If you look at what's happening in every corner of the world, whether you're in the United States, you're in the United Kingdom like I am, you're in India or China or the Gulf, in fact, there is a real challenge to the concept of free society. And those who seek to exploit the uncertainty, the political upheaval right now are looking to technology. And I think we have to also recapture the narrative around technology and really to remind people that it doesn't have to come at the expense of your privacy. It is something that can be used in the service of humanity, and that we don't, of course, we talk about these things in the language of human rights, but we can also talk about this in a very practical way. I think another vision, even purely in terms of responding to the coronavirus pandemic, is possible. A possibility where we give people a sense of comfort that their rights will be respected, and that means they'll be more willing to talk to us about the kind of situations that they might be. So I think those are some of the key things to really stress. I really look forward to questions that people might have, but I would also say that this is an extremely challenging and unprecedented situation, because what we're dealing with is not just this pandemic situation, but also the technology is advancing so much more quicker than our ability to, not just at a national level or a regional level, but internationally work together to make sure that what we have is technology that really works for all of us. So these are really profound situations, but I do see that there are some positives and some opportunities to do things better that are also there.
Thank you, Mustafa. That's very helpful insights on the Gulf. I love how you talk about them as desert nations that are largely urban, and where the vulnerable publics often constitute the majority of the population from a numerical perspective. One of our president emeritus of AGS has a series of articles on a term he coined, geo-slavery. And, the line between being a low-wage worker and being someone with no rights and no recourse, it forces you to kind of think about our definitions that we're living with, and how these technologies can exacerbate a lot of these their negative conditions. So thank you for that. I look forward to the Q&A with you. So let's move on to Vani Saraswati from migrantrights.org. Vani?
Hi, can you hear me? Yeah. Okay, so Mustafa has covered a lot of what I wanted to speak about because our work overlaps quite a bit in the region. As you said, my main concern is not the contact tracing apps that are being used now. It's the really the levels of surveillance that was already existing in the Gulf countries long before COVID. I lived in Qatar for about 18 years, and it took me a while to understand how intrusive the government was in my life. My ID had all my biometric details, and I couldn't access most public spaces without furnishing my ID. I couldn't go into a government office. I couldn't go into certain clubs. I couldn't go into the few pubs that were there unless I provided my Qatar ID. And that's the case across. They're constantly checking whether you are supposed to be in a certain space. And I had some social capital and privilege, so I had better access. But then you find that lower income workers, the so-called migrant workers, not the expatriates, this very duplicitous, I mean, the distinction they make really doesn't make sense because all of us are there under the same laws, governed by the same kafala system. Yeah. So my main concern is the existing surveillance that's already there, not just for foreigners living and working there who make up the majority, but for the citizens themselves. A lot of practices are criminalized. Mark's and Steve's presentations were very, very interesting and really applies to a lot of what happens in the Gulf countries in terms of sexual identity, sexual orientation, and gender identity as well. So what I would really want to talk about is what kind of surveillance is in place and how do we make sure that those living there are more aware of it, right? All of these countries, to either absolutely or to a large degree, tend to prohibit VPNs and do not allow VoIPs. So low-income migrant workers who do not have the resources to make direct phone calls depend very much on Facebook Messenger or social media, and they look at it as a safe space, even though they don't realize that that is being monitored. And if you look at the reports that Facebook and Twitter makes public, strangely, you'll find that countries like Saudi and UAE and all of these Gulf countries, which are surveillance states, which are police states, haven't requested for that many reports from the users. And that shouldn't be a cause for relief because it's a concern. That means they're already monitoring you. They really don't need to go to Facebook and Twitter to ask for user information. UAE, in fact, has the highest per capita CCTV coverage. They have the Falcon Eye surveillance. And the reason that they've given for this kind of mass surveillance is to control traffic and public hygiene. Now, both of these things are what is kicking in now with COVID, public hygiene, and where are you going? How are you crowding the space? And all of this is being misused. On top of all of this, except for Bahrain, all of the Gulf countries have very, very strict cybercrime laws. And these cybercrime laws are not like the ones you see in the Western countries where it is meant to protect users online. It's more to curtail freedom of speech. So you have some interesting Chatham House reports on this, on how the focus is on limiting freedom of expression, and they do not really combat cybercrime. And if you are a victim, say, of revenge porn, the woman is likely to be prosecuted, even if she is a victim. So you have this kind of cybercrime laws already in place. There's a climate of fear where people don't want to speak out. And then they think certain places are safe spaces, primarily Facebook. And I know of so many workers who are picked up based on their Facebook posts. And the workers are not involved in any criminal activities as we see it. In the Gulf countries, leaving your employment, even if it's been very abusive or exploitative, is criminalized. And a lot of the workers who leave exploitative employers tend to go on social media to connect to others to see if they could find a job. So surveillance is not only outsourced to the government, right? It's not just the government doing it. Under the kafala system, the individual employer, the citizen, has the ability to do that as well to the people they employ. They have all of the biometric details. As Mustafa mentioned earlier, there are just a handful of families in each of these countries that control everything. So the business that controls the employers and the state machinery, be it the Ministry of Interior, the Ministry of Labor, they're all interlinked. It's the same group, the same families that are working across all of these different sectors and ministries. And there's very little opportunity for workers trying to escape that net of surveillance. Another big issue is, of course, I want to focus a bit on domestic workers. When we first had the chat, Christopher, Katie, and I was talking about how, for a lot of women, domestic workers, access to communication itself is a problem. Forget about getting into the contact tracing. They do not even have a telephone to be able to communicate to their families. They've probably hidden a telephone and tried to, get free internet to speak to their families. Now, all of this is going to come out when contact tracing apps are made mandatory. In Qatar, there's a hefty fine if you don't have it on your phone, for instance. And in fact, when Qatar made the contact tracing app mandatory and they said that everybody has to download, what it did was it allowed the international community to speak about it. And Amnesty did kind of hacked it and came up with what the different issues were. And Qatar did respond to it, which is a good thing. But the fine still remains if you don't download it on it. The concern now is countries that don't even talk about contact tracing, the countries that don't talk about surveillance because you're already doing it and nobody can go and check on how it, what are the kind of human rights violations that could occur because of this. So you find in a place like Saudi, for instance, tens of thousands of workers, particularly women domestic workers, tend to be forced into irregularity because they're escaping abusive employment, but they don't want to go back home. They've made an investment to stay back and work, so they work irregularly. And these are the workers who are being now, who are going to be even more vulnerable than before. Because if they can't go out and they can't show proof of their health check or they're not able to move to find jobs, they're going to be stranded. And we've seen this case playing out in different countries. We've seen this in Mahbula area and Jalib area and Kuwait, which were under complete lockdown for weeks on end. And those are the areas where a lot of the low-income workers live. So we already know the location where these workers are living, but the ones who are going out to get the food relief were not the workers who had were not the irregular workers. They had to depend on other people to go get the food because they had to furnish the ID card to be able to access a lot of these relief that was being provided. So this is going to probably just keep getting worse. And another reason that it's going to get worse is there's this whole, in general, migrant workers, Gulf countries prefer them invisible. They're in large numbers, but they want to keep them invisible. So they want them to come and do the work and disappear into very remote areas outside of the urban structures that they are building. They do not want to, want their visibility to intrude upon whatever glitzy structures they are building. However, COVID has made them it's put a mark on these workers. So if you look at the thousands of cases that are being tested positive almost daily, the majority are non-nationals in all of these countries. One of the countries actually gave disaggregated data based on nationality. This is Kuwait. And that led to a huge backlash against Indians and Egyptians and the groups that they thought were not just at risk, but were risky for the nationals themselves. So all of the xenophobic narratives that come up periodically, be it an economic crisis or a health crisis, has been further exaggerated with COVID. Just gonna quickly go through last few points. Another thing is the user base of the social media platforms. I did a training some months ago in Jordan with domestic workers. There was an attempt to get them to mobilize to be able to speak for themselves. So the training was what kind of content should they put out so that other domestic workers can reach out to them and speak to them. So it was nationality wise. We had 8 different nationalities, and most of them were irregular. They did not have their, they didn't have a valid ID. The minute they came into the training, they all started taking photographs and posting pictures, and their location services was on their phone. None of them even thought about what that meant, that they were irregular and they were posting pictures so that their families back home know who they are. So that is also the level of awareness amongst a lot of the workers, that for them it's communication, for them it's sharing their life, but very often, even if it's not an individual at risk, they might be next to someone else who's irregular, who's left in employment, who's probably involved in practices that are considered criminal in the Gulf states. As I said earlier, sexual orientation, or even those who are involved in practices for money, sex work for money, but to earn a little bit extra. All of these images come out, and because these are people without much of a voice or support, there are no unions, as we said. Forget about unions. Even the civil society is not active. So even if there's a very, there is a clear violation, there are very few people who are going to speak up. Legal aid is not available in any of these countries except for 2. So what happens to these people? They just get deported. A ban is placed on them, and they go back home to a situation which was worse than before they first entered these countries. So when we are talking about how technology can be used by these governments, we also need to talk about how we could make the end users more aware of the risks of using these platforms and how they could protect themselves, not to discourage them from using it, because they're so isolated. You have men with families and children back home who are forced into a celibate bachelor life for years on end. So they need to form some kind of a online community that they feel a part of. How do we work with them in a way that they're safe doing that? Because I really have very little hope on advocating with these governments to be, less autocratic. So how do we protect the people who are part of that system is what I'd be concerned about. Thanks.
Bonnie, thanks so much. That it makes me, it makes your heart hurt, when you think about, when you learn about kind of the nature of these vulnerable publics in faraway lands, and entire systems, right? You talked about the kafala system, where there's entire established systems there to, oppress and control. So when you add mobile location tech, what is the role of those technologies when inserted into those systems? I'm sure we're going to have plenty of questions later on that. So thank you. Now we're going to move on to Andrew Young from NYU's GovLab, and also from Responsible Data for Children. Andrew, over to you.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Chris. And thanks to the whole AGS team for having me. It's great to have the opportunity to be a part of this discussion. One of the challenges always of having a last name like Young is that you end up following a bunch of really smart and important remarks. I'll try to keep up the intellectual momentum here. If we go to the next slide, please. Great, so that's just the title. So next slide, please. So as Chris mentioned, I am coming to you from the GovLab at New York University. We are an action research center where we explore, test, and implement various ways to leverage collective intelligence and data-driven technologies in the interest of improving governance and the effectiveness and legitimacy of institutions. Quite a lot of our work does focus on questions of, as I said, data use, but not specifically location data, but more generally open government data, data held in the private sector that could have potential public interest value, and questions of data responsibility, which we consider to be both a responsibility to protect data, which is the thrust of much of this discussion, and I will continue that focus, but also this question of a responsibility to use data when it can actually provide value in a safe and effective manner and actually improve people's lives, having that responsibility to avoid not just the misuse of data, but also the misuse of data. Next slide, please. And my remarks today will focus especially on our work in the Responsible Data for Children initiative, which was a partnership first initiated last year between the GovLab and UNICEF with the intention of building guidance tools and leadership support for responsible handling of data for and about children in various contexts, including especially in development and humanitarian contexts. Next slide, please. And a big piece of why we focused on this question of responsible data for children is that children have unique considerations when it comes to data responsibility. Responsible use of data is something that affects everyone. Ensuring safe and effective use of data is only becoming more central and important in the context of COVID-19. But children have unique vulnerabilities and require unique duties of care that aren't well recognized across the field, especially as more and more actors are actually analyzing and accessing children's data in the context of the pandemic. Next slide, please. So specifically, our work was really focused on 7 core ways that data responsibility issues are uniquely important and salient for children. First, today's children are the first generation growing up at a time of rapid datafication, where almost all aspects of their lives, both on and offline, are turned into data points. An entire generation of young people is being datafied, often starting even before birth. Every year, the average child will have more data collected about them in their lifetime than would a similar child any year prior. The potential uses of such large volumes of data and the impact on children's lives are unpredictable and could potentially be used against them. Second, children typically do not have full agency to make decisions about their participation in programs or services which may generate and record personal data. Children may also lack the understanding to assess a decision's purported risks and benefits. Privacy terms and conditions are often barely understood by educated adults, myself very much included, let alone young children. As a result, there's a higher duty of care for children's data. Third, disaggregating data according to socio-demographic characteristics can improve service delivery and assist with policy development. However, it also creates risks for group privacy, something that I think will come up a lot in the moderated Q&A as well, as an area that is not well represented in current policy and procedures. Disaggregated data for groups such as child-headed households and children experiencing gender-based violence can put vulnerable communities and children at risk. Data about children's location in particular can be particularly risky if a child has an additional vulnerability that could expose them to particular harm. Next, mishandling data, and this was something that came up in earlier remarks as well. Mishandling data can cause children to lose trust in institutions that deliver essential services, including vaccines, medicine, and nutrition supplies. For organizations dealing with child well-being, these retreats can have severe consequences. Distrust can cause families and children to refuse health, education, child protection, and other public services. Such privacy protective behavior can impact children throughout the course of their lifetime and potentially exacerbate existing inequities and vulnerabilities. And I think this is kind of a common theme across my remarks here, and also I think the panel in general, is that many of the risks and challenges that we are discussing predated the COVID pandemic, but what we're actually seeing is this current moment really amplifying, accelerating, and exacerbating some of these existing risks. So next is this question of unique obligations and protections. And I mentioned this a bit at the start, that as more and more volumes of data are collected and stored, obligations and protections traditionally put in place for children may be difficult or impossible to uphold. The interests of children are not always prioritized when organizations define their legitimate interest to access or share personal information. The immediate benefit of a service provided does not always justify the risk or harm that might be caused by it in the future. And data analysis may be undertaken by people who do not have expertise in the area of child rights, as opposed to traditional research where practitioners are specifically educated in child subject research. On the issue of algorithmic bias, while algorithmic decision making can expedite certain processes, algorithms and their inferences can possess bias that can have adverse effects on people, including children in particular. It's especially pronounced for children, in fact, and other vulnerable populations, in part due to their lack of awareness or resources necessary to respond to instances of bias or to rectify any misconceptions or inaccuracies in their data that might be used to actually drive decision-making or service delivery. And then finally, many of the children served by child welfare organizations or public institutions have suffered some trauma, whether physical, social, or emotional in nature. Repeatedly making children register for services or provide confidential personal information can amount to re-victimization, re-exposing them to traumas, or instigating unwarranted feelings of shame and guilt. So there's a lot to take in there in terms of these unique kind of issues around data responsibility for children. And this was really, again, kind of the impetus for our focus on the responsible data for children work, and now our consideration of the lessons learned from that effort, how they can be applied in the context of COVID-19. Next slide, please. Just very quickly, I'll go through the methodology and different outputs of the project and what that eventually led to. So we started off the initiative by doing a detailed literature review and development of an annotated selected reading list of various policies and procedures driving the handling of children's data in different contexts, particularly with a focus on child welfare organizations and international institutions. Next slide, please. But the core of the RD4C work was a series of field missions to various UNICEF country environments to really understand how children's data is being handled, not just by UNICEF country offices and their partners, but also government agencies, implementing NGOs, and other actors that might have access to children's data. Next slide, please. And the field missions that we undertook were intentionally diverse in nature. We looked at first a trip to Romania, where we were looking at a middle income environment with a strong regulatory regime in place, i.e. GDPR in the EU. We then looked at Kenya and looking at a more nexus environment where there's a large country program and quite a lot of international funding being poured into the region, which has both development and humanitarian objectives for child rights actors. And then finally, we did a field mission to Afghanistan to understand the current state of children's data in an emergency environment where, for various clearly justifiable reasons, data protection or data issues in general are generally not top of mind for many of the actors operating there. Next slide, please. And the lessons learned from all of this research was compiled into a synthesis report where we teased out some of the common challenges or established good practices in these various country environments, as well as recommendations for how UNICEF and other actors accessing and leveraging children's data could do so in a more responsible manner. Next slide, please. A core component of this work actually involved a development of tools based on identified needs and opportunities in those country environments that we visited, as well as the children's data ecosystem more generally. I'll mention very briefly two here. On the next slide, we have our diagnostic and risk assessment for assessing the unique issues and questions related to children's data handling. This kind of speaks to some of the issues that have, again, already been raised earlier around the importance of data responsibility strategies and a clear understanding of potential risks and harms to vulnerable publics being defined at the outset before implementation and early on in the process in ideally a participatory manner. And then if we go to the next slide, please. And this is the opportunity risk diagnostic. Next slide, please. Another core issue that I think will come up a lot in the moderated Q&A as well are these two issues of first, the data life cycle. So here we have our decision provenance tool, which is aimed at allowing different actors that are involved in intersectoral, often interinstitutional data systems that might be handling data about children, including in the context of the pandemic, how they can identify what activities are taking place at different stages of that life cycle and what actors are involved in those processes. So this is a very small graphic here, but what we're really encouraging people to think about is at the initiation stage, at the collection stage, processing, analysis, or use stage, what are the concrete specific actions that are being undertaken? Who is responsible for carrying out those actions? Who is accountable for how those actions take place? Who's consulted in the process? Who has access to this kind of decision-making process? Going back to that power discussion that again was raised earlier. And then who is kept in the loop? Who are the parties that can actually access information and be party to these efforts, as well as policy considerations where while the children's data ecosystem in some cases has a bit more of a policy basis than some other groups, is still lacking, I would say, on an international level. Next slide, please. Great. And then the last point that I'll touch on here coming out of the RD4C work was a set of principles that we identified as potential guides for future work around data responsibility in children. We have here what we call our 7 Ps that can actually support more effective and responsible handling of children's data. The first one is participatory, engaging and informing individuals and groups affected by the use of data for and about children. And that really also involves not just engagement for the sake of engagement, but really getting a sense of contextual risks and opportunities, given that data use and children's data risks and issues are highly contextual in nature. The second principle is around being professionally accountable, operationalizing responsible data practices and principles by establishing institutional processes, roles, and responsibilities. We often discuss the idea that principles, frameworks, guidelines only get you so far if it isn't somebody's job to actually implement them. So thinking about what that process is from going from good principles, good practices being understood and recognized to someone who's actually tasked with taking on those actions and policies and procedures that can guide that kind of work is really important. And another issue that again, I think we'll talk about more in the moderated Q&A is this question of professional accountability in terms of capacity to actually use the data that you are collecting or accessing. So if, for example, location data is being collected or shared by a private sector actor with a government institution, and that government institution doesn't have the capacity to actually conduct testing or activate any personnel to act on any insights that are derived from that data, then that collection and sharing is really irresponsible in a lot of ways because it's creating risks with no potential outcomes. So that question of use, a clear use case as part of professional accountability and the capacity to act on that use case is another really important issue here. Next slide, please. Then I think another issue that's come up a lot is this question of retention, how long are systems kept in place, this, which is really an issue of proportionality, aligning the breadth of data collection and the duration of retention with the intended purpose. If data systems are stood up in the context of the pandemic, then there should be clear provisions for how those data systems will go through a sunsetting process after the pandemic, we hope, is eventually under control here. Then we have the issue of protective of children's rights, recognizing again the distinct rights and requirements for helping children develop to their full potential. One issue here is really thinking about how we classify information by risks and sensitivities that are unique to children and their rights. Next slide, please. People-centric is another really important one, I think, in the context of COVID-19 as well, in thinking about always having the needs and expectations of children, their caregivers, and their communities prioritized by actors handling data for and about them. In my experience, we've seen quite a lot of moves toward interoperable, joined up data systems, essentially creating a single access point for various actors to tap into any and all information that an institution might hold on children's services, which often comes from a very positive place in the sense of lowering the friction of institutional use of data for and about children. But whenever we are balancing the question of potential risks and harms to children represented in that data versus potential efficiency gains or bolstering the findability of certain data records for institutional actors, we would argue that that the more people-centric and child-centric approach to that consideration of risks and rewards is really important. Then we have the prevention of harms across the data lifecycle. As I mentioned earlier, this question of not just data use as a monolith, but really getting down into the different stages of the data lifecycle and considering what opportunities, risks, and procedures need to be put in place across that move from initiation to collecting, storing, preparing, sharing, analyzing, and using. We tend to call this end-to-end data responsibility, and it's really an effort to move beyond discussions of singular issues like bias or access by malicious parties, looking at those totally in isolation when they tend to be part of a process and potentially accumulating risks over time. So having that focus on the data life cycle rather than individual kind of questions is another issue that we tend to see as it relates to children's data. Next slide, please. And the last of our Ps is in many ways the most important, and again, kind of particularly salient for the COVID-19 discussion, which is that data systems handling data about children should be purpose-driven. They should be able to identify and specify and articulate why a particular data set is needed and how the intended or potential benefits relate to improving children's lives. In the data for children space, as well as the data for good and public interest technology space in general, we quite often see data driving experimentation rather than particular purposes, intended value to be created or problems to be addressed. So really focusing on, again, not just being able to identify a purpose, but being able to clearly articulate that purpose and how data being collected or stored can actually serve that purpose in many ways is the core of all of this, I would argue. So those are our 7 Ps. Just a few final thoughts here and then eager to move to the moderated discussion. Can we go to the next slide, please? So specifically as it relates to COVID-19, these RD4C principles were recently released in some UNICEF guidance from the Office of Research, or Innocenti, where they looked at how these principles can actually guide UNICEF's work around digital contact tracing and surveillance. I mentioned a few of those key issues there. I think the one that really stands out for this use case is exactly this question of professional accountability and institutional ability to actually act on and use the data effectively. In the case of contact tracing, whether there is testing available, whether there is confidence in the accuracy of the data, and whether there are the resources in place to actually take some kind of action based on the insights that might be generated from that data. So this work is actually starting to guide UNICEF efforts around the world as it relates to their COVID-19 contact tracing and surveillance efforts. Next slide, please. And again, just a few final notes from the GovLab side. We are really trying to get our arms around what the current state of play is around the use of data for COVID-19, including but not limited to the use of location data in various projects. We are curating a living repository of data projects that are currently in place worldwide. I think the main message that I would pull out of that process is that we have over 300 examples identified of emergent, specifically COVID-19 related data generation and sharing projects. There is quite a lot of activity, and I would say not necessarily a lot of insight into the governance of these projects, which I think, again, an issue that was raised earlier is this visibility and transparency into how decisions are made and what the processes are guiding this work, and the governance of these kind of projects seems to be somewhat lacking, while the actual practice and experimentation is very, very rapidly accelerating and ramping up. And then next slide, please. And one last point from our end is that we are currently in the process of organizing a series of panels, again, with the support of our friends at AGS and also with the support of the Henry Luce Foundation, looking at public perceptions around the use of data or the reuse of data in the context of COVID-19, given the fact that, as I said, for children's data and for the use of data more generally, we see a lot of activity, a lot of use cases, a lot of speculative and aspirational value, and in some cases, some realized value of this kind of work, but we don't have a clear sense of what those guidelines and consideration should be as it relates to public perceptions around these data uses. So that's work that we are kicking off now, including with some specific focus on Edtech data collection, which is another key element here that I think will probably come up in the Q&A. The increased collection of data and sharing of data about children's interaction with remote learning platforms, which are often based on vendors providing them from the private sector. And then I think I just have a thank you slide after this, so I will end there. And thank you so much for having me again, and looking forward to the full group discussion. Thanks so much.
Well, thank you, Andrew. I really appreciate highlighting the vulnerability of children around the world. And what I'm struck by, I guess, through the breadth of this discussion with all of our panelists, is we have this huge spectrum where we have some places in the world, some nations, some governments that, you know, are, I don't know, not looking out for the most vulnerable in the population. And then we have other governments that actually aspire to remove vulnerabilities or support these vulnerable populations like children. And, you know, it's kind of almost like two completely different, it's almost like schizophrenia, right? Like one time I have to think about how can I make the right investments? What are the right positive guidelines in order to very much move these nations up a development curve, support those vulnerable publics. And then in the next case, it's, you know, how can I prevent an autocratic government from destroying the lives of vulnerable publics? And I think in the Q&A, I'm very interested in hearing how we together can kind of navigate that full spectrum. You know, we'll be moving into this kind of moderated Q&A. I know we had a number of questions that we circulated amongst the panelists. I'm interested in all of your opinions from your different perspectives. Maybe not everybody wants to answer, you know, chime in on any particular question. But I would also encourage the audience to continue putting their Q&A into WebEx, and we'll get to those in our next stage. So I'd actually like to start with probably the second question that I circulated. And I want to start with Mark, but I think it's kind of a generic question that you're going to get very different answers based on these different vulnerable populations. So question is, you know, in geography, we often talk about geography as the art of making the invisible visible, right? We put things on maps that may not be apparent to the eye, or maybe on a distant side of the planet that you don't have much visibility into. Some vulnerable publics are invisible in official processes due to neglect and oversight, right? The official processes simply don't account for them, and they don't put them on the map. They don't collect data. Others, due to systematic and intentional exclusion, are left off the map, right? The the government, the powers that be, simply don't want them tracked, and to put them on the map is to admit they exist and perhaps even give them rights or sovereignty. Still others intentionally seek to stay off of everyone's radar. And I think, Mark, when you talked about some of these safe houses, safe havens, safe spaces, if you know that you're likely to be tracked, if you know there's a downside, you're going to seek to somehow keep your safe spaces off the map. So how should we think about vulnerable public's geographic invisibility as it relates to mobile location tech during COVID-19 and beyond? And I think I'd start that one with Mark, and we'll all fumble through how to do this properly over WebEx, raising hands, and but we'll start with Mark and then move on to others. Go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. It's an interesting question. I mean, so much of the LGBTI movement, the human rights movement, is about coming out and being visible, but it's equally absolutely important to preserve your invisibility when you need it, right? So you need to be invisible in some of these safe spaces in order to organize. At the same time, you need to be able to visualize yourself, to come out, but on your own terms, not on the government terms, right? And so the president of Iran famously came to New York to the UN a few years ago, right, and said there are no gay people in Iran. Well, ultimately, the community has to be able to come out and say we're here, but on their terms. But when the government can dictate those terms and can use that information to identify who you are, where you are, and potentially arrest you because of that, it's incredibly dangerous. So I think we need to think about how we use data both to become visible, but also to protect our invisibility, particularly in these difficult contexts.
That's great. Mustafa, successful use of the hand. Thanks, Mustafa. Over to you.
Yeah, I thought I'd give it a shot. So hopefully, yeah, that was effective. Yeah, it's a really great question. I mean, I think that there's the privacy aspect to it, and then there's another aspect to it when it comes to human rights. And I think Mark has really hit the nail on the head. I think from a privacy perspective, one way to think about it is, when all of us go to our homes, we kind of expect that no one's going to be peering into our windows, that we choose to, when we want, leave the front door. Everyone can see us. We might get into a local bus or train. We go to the office, but we have our privacy. So underlying it, even though technology has changed many of the situations, it's actually a very, an old principle, which is the respecting that right to privacy. And one of the problems with new technology is that through stealth, it basically exposes you in ways that you have no idea. So that, you might accept all the terms on your Google account or your Facebook account, but you may not know that actually you're allowing that company to then sell your data onto other companies or to the intelligence services or whatever. So a big part of it is to respect that privacy. If you respect that privacy, then you give a person the chance to exercise their right to choose when and how they in the public space. Obviously, the second point is that you have to protect people's rights. As Mark said really powerfully with the example of Iran, is that there's times when you have to come out to challenge even your very existence as a group, but you might not be able to do that because you'll get suppressed if you do that. So if we haven't actually respected people's fundamental rights, then you're not going to get that happening. Now, one thing I will say to end is that even in places which are relatively free, there are many people that are in some way persecuted, and amongst those are low-wage migrant workers. In the UK, for example, if a migrant worker is here and they've been trafficked into the country, the way that the system operates is that they will be prosecuted as so-called illegal migrants, even if they're actually coming to the police because they've been trafficked. And so if you don't actually provide that basic respect for the human rights, I mean, you can put in all the technology and all the protections and checks and balances, but you won't deal with that. So that's another thing to really stress, which is it goes beyond the technology to what's the actual human rights situation, in the society.
A great set of points, Mustafa. What else? Did I see Vani had put her hand up? Go ahead, Vani. Still muted.
So talking about physical spaces and tech spaces, as I mentioned earlier, this whole xenophobic narrative that low-income migrants especially are going to dilute the national identity and the cultural identity of these countries. So they keep them away from public spaces like malls and like parks and public events. We have that on the one hand, and then you have this whole thing where now you have to justify your presence by showing that you're, you have a right, or you're safe enough to be in these spaces, right? So they're going to tap into technology to decide if you can actually come in. It's not just about how you appear, how you look, which country you're from. I'm going to bring in an India example here. So the food delivery apps, the gig economy, like we have Zomato and Swiggy, they all, if you open the app, you'll see that the rider his temperature has been checked, that he's not positive for whatever reasons. And this whole thing that, okay, this rider is a part of the risk group, we are going to protect our customer. It doesn't matter if the customer has a high fever or could be symptomatic or asymptomatic. That is not a concern. They look at the worker as a problem. So you have housing compounds, both in the Gulf and here in India, where the domestic workers coming in are being tested, right? It's just a temperature check. But there's no question of checking if the employer is probably a carrier. So you're finding ways in which the apps are being, where have you been? So for domestic workers or for cleaning company staff, slowly the economy is coming up and companies are looking at where have you been, which are the locations you've been to make sure that it's safe enough for you to enter our premises, but you don't have a right to know where we've been. This kind of discrimination also is coming up.
Great, thank you, Vani. I saw Andrew, and then we'll go to Stephen. Go ahead, Andrew.
Great, thank you. I think in general terms, in thinking about visibility and kind of participation in data systems, a lot of that really comes down to me to the variables and criteria of the data use. What is kind of the recipe that's leading into a particular data project? Is there centralized or decentralized storage of the information? Are there clearly defined data retention procedures or not? What level of aggregation is the data being held at? Is it personally identifiable? Is it group level data? What is the data package that is being developed or shared? Is it location data plus other points that might provide a more nuanced and potentially actionable picture of individuals or groups? Among other kind of a very specific kind of design and governance questions that often create trade-offs. There is, I think, inherent to this discussion, an issue of increased data use could potentially lead to certain positive outcomes as it relates to the pandemic, but they almost always will lead to new or expanded risks around privacy and potentially security. And there isn't going to be an easy answer of one or the other, I think, in many cases. And I think with these design kind of questions and governance questions, we could add a little bit of nuance and potentially find the type of recipe or formula that could be beneficial to people. I think what needs to happen in many cases, and I think in certain environments, it's easier to do than others, is to actually take that participatory design process to heart and thinking about engaging with communities and representatives of communities to get their input on what the value of these different trade-offs might be, so that the design can actually be aligned and these nuanced kind of characteristics can be aligned with the actual perceptions and opinions and needs and identified risks of the particular communities that we're seeking to serve.
There's some good points, and I think what is a design criteria to one that has good intentions could also be, in effect, the elements of an audit for regimes that are rolling out apps that somehow don't necessarily have good intentions. So somehow those design criteria can be used in both cases. Stephen, I saw you had some comments.
Yeah, no, what I wanted to sort of touch upon, and this builds a little bit on what Vani and others have mentioned, is that, I have a fundamental skepticism that in autocratic countries, countries that suffer from underlying inequality and political abuses, that there's a way to put in place technology in a responsible manner that over time protect against the predations of the state. I think, look at something at the example Vani mentioned, where you have a structural inequality present between migrant workers who are given much lower levels of rights that are guaranteed versus employers and those who are considered to be full citizens. So there's no way with that context or that dynamic in mind, particularly if you're looking at Gulf states, for example, that you can assume that any kind of contact tracing mechanism, any kind of digital technological capability, particularly one that involves surveillance, is going to be equitable between all manners of residents. They are both full citizens, migrant workers, and so forth, because the underlying conditions lend themselves that way. And so I've asked myself a lot of times the question between, to what extent is repression driven or exacerbated by technology, and to what extent is it a political circumstance that technology reacts from? And I really tend to sort of fall in the latter camp, and that I look to the political situation to then understand what the digital fallout or spillover effects will be. And so if you look at something like COVID-19, I don't come in with the assumption that countries that forget autocratic countries, let's look at hybrid regimes, illiberal democracies, and so forth. I wouldn't have thought coming in that countries like India or Turkey or the Philippines or Brazil would have done great when it comes to COVID-19 and contact tracing apps. And so far, empirically, that's been borne out, and it doesn't surprise me on that end. So, part of the answer is certainly building in the right principles when it comes to responsible use of technology, but part of the other problem is, how do you link that to existing rule of law frameworks, ways to redress abuses that occur, so that there is a way to kind of get at that full dynamic. And that to me, it becomes extremely tricky, because you're asking really tough questions that get at fundamental issues, fundamental political issues.
Good points. Before I move on, I've got another question. Anybody want another shot at that one? No? Okay. So there's a fine line between law enforcement, right, enforcing the laws that we would like to have enforced, and over policing. And how can we think about law enforcement versus over policing and the role of mobile location tech as it relates to different vulnerable publics in the context of COVID-19 and beyond? Like, is that a useful distinction, or should we be thinking about it in some other way? Maybe I'll go with, well, actually, I'm watching my screen and I have Andrew refreshing. Mustafa raised his hand, so I'll go to Mustafa first.
Sorry, I'm a bit sorry to jump in there, but yeah, I think it's a really key question. I mean, I think what we're seeing globally in many countries, obviously in the US, it's got global attention around the whole situation with Black Lives Matter and the policing aspect, is over policing to me means the overextension of a law enforcement or security authority to matters that are basically beyond their mandate, to basically a social issue that you're looking to the police to deal with, for example, in a very impoverished neighborhood where there is lawlessness, where there's situations of political protest, where the state is refusing to respond to what the demands are, that you basically throw it on the police. I've done a lot of work on security force and police force violations, particularly in South Asia, including Afghanistan. And one thing that has always struck me with that work is, there's some really terrible situations I documented, but I couldn't help feeling often, not always, that, I felt for the police, and that might sound surprising. What I mean by that is that too often authorities throw the police or security authorities at a problem that they can't really solve. And so I think part of it is to really think about what is actually underlying driving the situation. So for example, if we were only to focus on the Gulf situation, if you have a situation where 90% of your population are foreigners, the majority of those are men, as Vani mentioned, who are effectively single men. I mean, that actually is a law and order issue. You know, you do have the risk of, violent protests or, disorderly behavior that has to be addressed. But when you throw a mass of people in these very dehumanized camps, into these very dehumanized settings, when their rights are not respected, that is going to have consequences. So you have to really deal with that. And as other speakers have mentioned, along with throwing the police at these social problems, there is now also an increasing tendency to throw technology at the problem. But if you don't really deal with the underlying issues, then it doesn't really address the kind of problems that you're facing. And I think on the other side, where the tech can actually help, is that it might be challenging when you have a very intractable situation to directly speak to people face to face. But you could use technology as a way to give people a safe space to speak about what they're feeling, what are their concerns. And you certainly see some companies, some mega projects, not to say that this is somehow a panacea for all the problems there, but they've used those kind of technologies to allow workers, for example, to express any concerns they might have about their living or working conditions or their psychosocial situation. So I think actually technology can play a role, but if you don't deal with underlying issues, then absolutely you're not going to address those problems. And the over policing thing, it reflects there's the police aspect, and I think we can't ignore that police brutality element, but it goes deeper than just how the police are behaving.
I saw Mark's hand and I saw Vani nodding her head. We'll go with Mark and then go down the list. Go ahead, Mark.
The only other thought that I'd offer there is that I think what Steve has been talking about, without a strong regulatory framework and a government that can be trusted, I think government access to massive amounts of data is always going to lead to over-policing. I really question, I think you need a really, really strong government with a strong regulatory framework. And one interesting thing to think about, someone may have more details, but I read recently that Norway has just decided to turn off their contact tracing app, right? They've decided that the virus, they're getting it under control, and the government itself decided that they can't be trusted with that much data, that it's just, even in a country like Norway, it's inherently unsafe for the government to have too much access to data. And so, I think that's really an important point, because I think inevitably, even the Norwegian government with too much access to too much data could end up over policing.
I see, Vani, did you want to chime in? I also see Steven's hand. Oh, go ahead, Vani.
I just wanted to say, in the Gulf, as we've been discussing all along, there's no real separation between the two, because these are police states. The minute you enter, even if you're on a transit visa, you will realize that. Just 2 days there, you'll realize you're being watched all the time. And also, because the visa regime is actually outsourced to private citizens, they also become part of the policing as your sponsor. There's no separation of work visa and your residence visa. It's not the government that is sponsoring you. So the policing goes many levels down, and I really don't see a separation in the Gulf context the way you would say, the Norway example or even the US.
Great, thank you, Vani. Stephen.
Yeah, I wanted actually just to quickly weigh in on a point Mark made at the end, which I give the example of Norway in my presentation. I just ran out of time, but what was interesting about the happened. This was there was an Amnesty International expose, and they identified 3 countries, so Norway, Bahrain, and Kuwait, as having launched intrusive COVID-19 contact tracing apps. Now, what happened since the Amnesty expose, as Mark mentioned, Norway has suspended the app's rollout and is rethinking some of the basic principles of responsible use and privacy with regard to that. And Norway also happens to be one of the strongest liberal democracies in the world. Bahrain and Kuwait have not modified their programs at all. They haven't changed their programs. They haven't suspended the apps. These are also countries that happen to be closed authoritarian states that have very little inclination to protect privacy rights. So that is a perfect example and illustrates, sort of the conundrum you face when, all three countries have very legitimate interests in terms of stemming COVID-19, but the response that they are willing to implement varies significantly, in large part based on their political environment.
Great. Anybody else want to chime in on that? Okay. So, that was a distinction between over-policing and law enforcement. I think we've had this other distinction between kind of democracy and autocracy. We've heard democratizing and autocratizing. How can we, maybe think about that spectrum with a little more nuance there? Because, the question of like, how much does a country's level of democracy and protection under rule and law matter as it relates to COVID-19 and health tracing apps? I mean, I've kind of heard, if it's autocratic, forget about it. If it's democratic, maybe, but now democratic states are rejecting that. So is there about that spectrum of, kinds of governments or kinds of governance frameworks? Because in the end, we're going to have to hang our, what do you want to call it? We're depending on something, right? Whether it's a regulatory framework or a public law, whatever, we have to depend upon that governance structure ultimately to support us. Is there too much nuance there, or did we just decide that no government can be trusted with this data? Anybody? I see Mustafa nodding his head, but he's not taking the bait. So, all right, go ahead, Mustafa.
I think it's Chris, it's a really good point. I mean, one of the challenges of the sort of democracy autocracy dichotomy is that it's a bit misleading. I mean, obviously, if it's China, North Korea, the Gulf states, that gets kind of easy. But the real question, I think, is in a democracy, what kind of accountability is there over the main sort of government? In most democracies, there's an executive government, there's a separation of powers. And so what you're seeing increasingly, particularly after September 11, globally, there was this real influx of security legislations, which gave these amazing powers to generally quite unaccountable intelligence agencies. And there's no question that, there are situations where there's sensitive information that has to be protected. But in general, what you see is there's not enough oversight. And so I think the easiest way that you can test it in a democracy, like I said, in an autocracy, it's a bit easier, is how does that state treat the most vulnerable in that situation, in their society? How does it treat refugees, people who are so-called illegal migrants? How are they treated? If they have a violation situation, what mechanisms are open to them to challenge that? And I think, you can go into more detail than that, but that is an initial test to take. If you are gay, if you are from a religious minority, if you are effectively not a national, and the police abuse you, does the state actually have a way for you to effectively get justice for that? And if it doesn't have that, then even if you're a democracy, for all intents and purposes, you're not a free society for that vulnerable population. So I think that's something as well that, I'm sure I don't have to say this really, but, democracies are incredibly fragile things. I grew up in Australia. I've lived in Pakistan as a human rights expert for a long time. I traveled to the Gulf. When you don't have basic freedoms, you really notice it. But these freedoms have been fought for, and they are very easy to take away. So we're in a situation now where if we don't really push to protect those rights, it's a very, they don't just happen automatically. We really have to stand up and make it known that we care about these rights and we expect them to remain. So we should not get relaxed because we live in a democracy that everything is going to be fine.
Right. Great. Yeah, I mean, robust systems of recourse. Stephen.
Yeah, just a couple points in response to that, and I fully agree that these are fragile things, and that democracies rise and fall on a periodically. Living in the United States right now, the United States is very much going through an illiberal moment where its own protection of basic civil liberties has been measured to be in decline, over the last 5 to 10 years. So we're witnessing that at the moment here in the U.S. But one of the things I've done in my research is that I have tried to find relationships between general digital repression uses, so from surveillance to censorship to disinformation and so forth, and political systems. And there's a very robust relationship between political systems that are democratic and lower levels of digital repression. And that holds across the board. So while I do think that there are exceptions that we can look at, as a general principle, as a general rule, in terms of you were to look at the political system and make a snap judgment and say, okay, based on what we know about where power is concentrated and levels of political freedoms and so forth, all of which are definitional elements to what makes up an autocracy, you can also then make the assumption that there are greater amounts of technological and digital abuses as well. Now, there's a few places I think that are worth thinking about that kind of are partial exceptions. So Singapore is a place where there is generally a more responsible use of technology towards specific public interest. But even in a place like Singapore, I think you can make a very strong argument that there are a number of vulnerable publics that are prone to exploitation or are fearful of their political liberties as a result of a government that is autocratic. So I think it's kind of in some ways it goes down to responsiveness in terms of when you have a ruling authority, whether it's autocratic or democratic. Who are you responsive to? Are you responsive to the elites that are propping up your government? Are you responsive to public opinion? Are you responsive at all to vulnerable publics, and do those vulnerable publics have a voice in shaping public discourse? And too often in autocratic states, I think the answer is usually no.
Great. Does anybody else have anything to chime in on that? Okay. So
just one quick thing, Chris, if that's okay.
Yeah, please.
Sorry. So I think the one issue that I would just raise is whether governments are the actual data collectors in each of the cases that we're discussing. I think that a lot of discussion is focused on government getting access to particular types of data, but we often see different types of intermediaries actually driving the work, whether it's civil society organizations, NGOs, research centers, and the like. And whether or not those actors have the capacity to actually take action based on insights that they might derive, those insights, rather than raw data, could be shared with different actors, public, international, or subnational, that could act on that information. So I think whether autocracies could potentially initiate responsible COVID data projects, I certainly tend to agree that's hard to kind of envision. But there are other actors that do have some capacity and some at least perceived legitimacy that might be ways to make progress on these kind of use cases. Again, incredibly context specific. And in certain cases, I think that it is probably a non-starter in a lot of ways, but there are actors that could potentially provide some value and actually do a lot of that data collection and analysis and be the ones that are actually touching on the raw data or potentially sensitive data, with only the insights being then filtered on to other actors.
Great point. So I'm going to move on to a different question. And I'm particularly interested in, how are health surveillance apps connected to a broader ecosystem of policy, a broader ecosystem of digital tools used by governments for policy and political processes, right? So, I mean, I'm sure it's different by nation. Some nations, while autocratic, may have a robust health ministry. Others may all just be run out of the same digital surveillance shop. I've heard stories, from East Asia in, what you might call more liberal democracies, but that have, you know, a history of kind of a strong authoritarian core, that, you know, that oftentimes they're using the data out of the same, you know, the same apparatus, but it does have a robust check and democracy. And then there's other places that may have less of that robust check, but it's actually differentiated bureaucratically, right? The work is actually done by a different group of folks. Do any of you have any insights or experience into that, where those health apps sit in that larger ecosystem of tools? Anybody? I'm sorry, and feel free to speak up because I'm oh, maybe that question just doesn't hit. Okay.
I can jump in with just a quick thought, kind of reiterating something that I mentioned in my remarks, which this feels of a piece with a generalized kind of rush toward interoperability and data commingling that I've seen in various contexts, including democratic contexts. And in certain cases, that might be for nefarious purposes, in others, again, for the intention of efficiency and ensuring that every actor who could potentially find use in a particular data set has easy access to it through one centralized repository. And I think that is one of my big concerns as it relates to new data generation, new apps, creating data about children, other vulnerable publics, and the public in general, being kind of thrown into one big pot with a lot of other information, in health information management systems and the like. So I think that is one of the big concerns, is whether it does exactly kind of fold into existing systems and be part of a general kind of push toward making as much data as accessible to as many parties all at once.
Okay, great. Vani, go ahead.
Yeah, so in the Gulf context, it's a welfare state for citizens, but some of the states don't provide free healthcare for migrants or expatriates. They need to have some kind of insurance cover. In the COVID context, they are providing, quarantine facilities or even treatment for free, but only limited to that. So if you have other associated health conditions, you don't have access. But you already have to you have to use the app, and you have to be part of that system for this very narrow treatment process. But you're not really included fully for the rest of it. So that's a cause for concern. And discriminatory healthcare services is there across all of the 6 countries where citizens get treated and where, low-income migrants get treated at different facilities.
It's interesting how it's tied to larger national decisions about healthcare precede COVID-19. That's very interesting. Mustafa, sorry, I'll go to Stephen and then Mustafa. Go ahead, Stephen.
Just one thing I would note, I mean, first of all, I think one of the problems when it comes to potential use of health data towards security ends, for example, is that in countries with a lack of transparency, autocratic systems, it's impossible to really know what happens behind the scenes and to what extent security apparatuses have the ability to access that information or demand that it come from health ministries, even if there is sort of separation on paper. But one thing I have, sort of looked at when it comes to generally how countries are organized is you kind of look at the sophistication of their coercive apparatuses. You look at the sophistication of the intelligence and security agencies that are put together. In countries that are fragmented and that tend to be less diverse in terms of how they're able to access information and then apply it, there is, I think, a lower risk of actually being able to have interoperability when it comes to the data, because there's so much bureaucratic fragmentation within. So certain countries, that have lower capacity, like the Democratic Republic of the Congo, for example, that's where I would have less concern about the ability to access data from within. But when you look at highly sophisticated, integrated security apparatuses, where intelligence is sort of all-encompassing, like China, for example, I mean, you almost have to go in with the assumption that not only based on past precedent, but just based on the use of data to fuel intelligence-related actions, that kind of crossover effect will occur.
Great.
Maybe just one other thought as I've been thinking about your question, Chris, in the context of HIV, right? So we have found with our PEPFAR investments around the world that often the US government can work with health ministries and can really get into those health ministries, work with public health officials in a way that they can't work with the rest of the government. I think of Uganda, for example, where we've had robust investments in the health ministry in Uganda. And Uganda is running around arresting LGBTI folks. They just rounded up 20 LGBTI youth from a homeless shelter and threw them in prison for 2 months, right? The government is really problematic, but the health ministry understands that to get a handle of the HIV epidemic, they have to reach out and work with and support the LGBTI community. So it is schizophrenic, and it's worked to a certain degree, but it's still really dangerous. And every once in a while, there's such a flare up in the central government that the health ministry can't do anything about it, right? So again, there is that differentiation between public health officials and health ministries, but I think it's really fragile and dangerous and not to be trusted.
Great. So I'm actually going to move to one last question, if nobody else wants to chime in on that, before I go to the Q&A from what's been coming in from our audience. And I'm a little bit hesitant to even ask this question because we focus so much on authoritarian governments. But do you see ways that vulnerable publics can use mobile location tech to their advantage during COVID-19 and beyond? And I mean, we're basically saying their phones are hacked, they're being overpoliced, but do we, if there are positive things they can do we want to talk about them publicly, because then maybe those mechanisms will be deleted from their portfolio of possibilities. Is that a meaningful question? Or Mustafa raised his hand.
Again, Chris, a really great question. I mean, one of the perhaps beauties of the pandemic is it's shown that we're all human beings. Viruses, I mean, our societies discriminate, so that has a reflection on who's getting infected, but the viruses don't. And, in fact, it's forced governments all over the place to realize that even the marginalized people in their society, in fact, we should, to some extent, actually worry about how they're treated. So I think that not ignoring the challenges that we've already talked about and the uses of technology in a negative way with those marginalized people, on the other side, it's actually a rare opportunity to actually be recognized as someone that has rights, that the society has obligations to respect that. And I mean, certainly in the Gulf and some other countries that myself and my team work in, where public space is very shut down, for example, low-wage workers or women's groups have actually used social media platforms like WhatsApp or whatever it might be as a way of organizing, to be talking to each other, to be sharing information. Obviously, this is not a black and white situation where everything is good or everything is bad. There are nuances and complexities there. But I think, what you say is a really good point, which is that definitely there is an opportunity there, and it's something that we should really try to build on top of that. And there I said also, look, in so many countries where, for example, with the Black Lives Matter movement in the US, there's been a similar one in the UK, perhaps not to the same extent, but people have actually used online technologies as a way of organizing, because it is more, particularly during the lockdown periods, it was more challenging to get out on the streets. So there certainly are opportunities there. And I think, we have to be working collectively to think about ways to really not just use this as short-term responses, but how do we actually utilize that as a long-term positive to empower marginalized people?
Agone?
I'm on mute. Vani, go ahead. I apologize.
Apart from what Mustafa said about how marginalized groups use social media platforms to mobilize, the way we have used location services is a lot of the workers are either a semi-literate or don't know English, and so voice notes comes in handy. The other, when we need to reach them for relief or to rescue, location services are fantastic. So they just drop their point on their WhatsApp, and then, I'm not going to give away too much, but we have a network who's able to go and help them. which otherwise would be really difficult because they don't know where they are. They're new to this place. They've gone from the airport to the employer's place. They don't know where they are. So these location apps, and it's easy to teach them how to use it. So we found that useful. So I wouldn't want that to go away completely.
That's an important point. Yeah, that's great. Did anybody else have want to chime in on that question before I go to the Q&A from the audience? Okay. Well, seeing no hands. So the first question I'd like to focus on is something we really haven't talked about at all in the context of vulnerable publics, and that's really focused on big tech, right? In the US, we talk about big tech a lot because there are companies, you know, Facebook, Google, Apple, Amazon, all these companies, you know, kind of are building blocks of our daily lives. But when we're talking about vulnerable publics around the world, how do we think about it? While we've been focusing on kind of this accountability of governance, how can we also hold big tech accountable in ensuring users' rights, privacy when they're vulnerable publics in countries far, far away? Does anybody have strong opinions on that or experience with the role big tech, you know, should play as it relates to mobile location tech, vulnerable publics during COVID-19 and beyond?
I just wanted to give an example.
Oh, please.
Yeah, this is a recent BBC Arabic documentary that looked at big tech facilitating modern day slavery, and that's something that my organization helped them with, helped research and help them with the documentary itself, but how Facebook, Twitter, Instagram are used to sell work visas and workers themselves online. I must say, though, they said they would take action. It hasn't been consistent. Instagram took down a few posts. Facebook took down a few pages and groups, but they haven't responded to it in a consistent way where they disallow this kind of trading in humans on their platform. So some attempt was made, and BBC's Arabic documentary did throw some light on it in the Gulf context.
Okay. Not sure if anybody else. Yeah, go ahead, Mustafa.
Yeah, I think it's a really key issue. I mean, when you have Facebook having what 3 billion users, it is effectively an institution that really breaks this barrier between the state and the sort of private sector. I mean, I think it's it's a great question because even when the state is involved, it invariably is using private actors to help it with data. I mean, I think as Vani's talked about, one of the challenges you have is you have these often billion-dollar companies that simply have not invested the resources that they need to be really monitoring the impacts of their technology. And the thing is, there's already a framework within international human rights, which is the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, which talks about in a very practical way how, if you are a business, you seek to identify your human rights impacts, how you do due diligence to effectively drill down a bit more deeply, and how you respond to that and remedy that. Now, there may be challenges in doing that. Like I said, Facebook, 3 billion users, that's a very massive amount of data to look at. But, if you have such resources put into tracking our information to sell us products and to do advertising, then I would say that you have ethically an obligation to also be tracking down to the same extent what are the social impacts. And I think they need to resource with properly trained, properly expert people that know about the context. And we know for a fact that with, for example, migrant workers, people in gay communities, people from places like Myanmar, everyone is using things like Facebook, WhatsApp, and in a good way and in a bad way. So there are no real mysteries about what's happening on these platforms. But we also know that legally, because there is no real international system really to hold companies to account, it's still a nation by nation based structure, except for probably in the EU. We don't have the sufficient legal architecture to really make sure that these actors are held accountable and are required to properly regulate the spaces where these issues can happen.
That's great. I'm going to go to Mark before I go to Stephen, but I do want to, there's another great question on a similar topic before I hand it over to Mark. How does the panel feel about private platforms storing and having these data where there's no oversight, transparency, and any real form of grievance resolution. But I'll just, since we're talking about private platforms, I'll throw that one on. But over to you, Mark.
Well, I think there's a lot of concerns with private companies storing that data. But going back to the previous question as well, I would just note, I don't know if I would say it, the LGBTI social networking apps, I don't know if I would call them big tech, but they're important tech, right? They're really important for LGBTI individuals to meet each other and communicate around the world, particularly in dangerous environments. But they have been misused by governments, particularly in Chechnya, in Egypt, a number of other countries, where the governments have used those social networking apps to entrap people, to arrest them, and to find their location. And some of those apps have, in fact, turned off their geo-positioning function in those countries because of the danger. And they also generally, if you log in on one of those countries, they often flash a warning saying, you know, the government can misuse this, and really have taken some steps to really recognize that they are putting people at risk, even if it's important to continue to allow individuals to find each other. So, you know, I think there are some interesting discussions to be had in there.
Great, thank you, Mark. Stephen?
Yeah, I first of all, I think Mark really touches upon an important point. Even in social media platforms that, you know, big tech platforms that in of themselves aren't necessarily inclined to provide, you know, specific data of dissidents or those who are, you know, government critics to governments, they have enough vulnerabilities, and governments have enough technology to exploit those platforms either through social media monitoring or other more targeted techniques, that it becomes fairly easy to use the information posted on these social media platforms for a variety of things, whether it's political persecutions, whether it's actually tracking and obtaining location information. So that's, to me, is sort of one vulnerability. But the other thing I also want to mention is that big tech is not just you know, YouTube, Twitter, Facebook. Big tech is also WeChat. It's also TikTok. And what we do know from the research that's been conducted, like by outfits like Citizen Lab, for example, is that those platforms are so directly tied into government political agendas, so that WeChat undertakes you know, censorship filtering. It hands over data without any real understanding of any kind of protections in place to the government upon request, that is then used for persecution. You can look at some of the data and evidence when it comes to the persecution of the Uyghur minority as it relates to WeChat, finding individuals not only within the mainland China, but also abroad. So, you know, big tech, as you think about it, and as it relates across a wide variety of populations beyond just US-oriented platforms, are extremely problematic. And as we see a greater push towards cyber sovereignty and a fragmentation of the internet, with Hong Kong being the latest example of China using technology as a means to consolidate control, this is a trend that is only continuing and consolidating going forward from my perspective.
That's great. Does anybody else have want to chime in on that before I jump to the next question? Okay.
Quick thought,
yeah,
Chris.
Go ahead, Andrew. Please.
So I think putting aside slightly the issues that have already been raised about the amount of data collected and the ways that these social media platforms in particular can be used to create risks and harms. One issue that I've been thinking about a lot is the use of social media information, including especially social media derived location data or data derived from telecom companies, being used to inform policies or inform the targeted delivery of services. We see a number of collaborations between private sector data holders and researchers and or first response kind of agencies. And one of the big questions for children in particular is whether or not you think that that kind of data should be collected or should be shared with these kind of responders. It is, and it is being used to drive decision making. And for children in particular, who in many environments, particularly in particularly vulnerable ones, are unlikely to hold a cell phone day in and day out, might not be represented back to the visibility versus invisibility question in some of these data streams that are then ultimately used to, deliver services and build policies based on where people tend to be or where they have moved or where people are or are not moving. So I think that's the other kind of wrinkle of this, again, kind of skipping to the current state rather than the kind of collection processes that got us into the current situation, is how are decisions being made based on this information, and who is not represented, and which communities. In some cases that might be, I think, as already discussed at length, sometimes not being represented in those data sets is a good thing for certain groups. But whenever it's the basis for service delivery or policy making, then it might get a little bit more complicated than that.
Great. Okay. Well, if nobody else wants to chime in on that, I've got a great question that asks about, well, in particular, I'm very interested in kind of the migrant worker kind of viewpoint on this. So there's some countries that as you transit through their hub, they magically install things on your phones or magically pull things off your phones. Based on your kind of experience and insights on that, how should we think about that and the most vulnerable, particularly, given access to your GPS and your location and stuff like that? Is that a real worry? Is this something that is a tip of an iceberg, or is it just kind of a distraction in the larger debate? Mustafa, go ahead.
And this is another really great question. I mean, the short answer is yes, we should be really worried about it. It's not a minor thing. There are cases of dissidents, people who are, publicly prominent on human rights issues, political issues, being actually stopped or even taken on the basis of how they were surveilled when they entered a country. With Corona, what we're seeing now is many countries, particularly autocratic countries, have made it a crime not to download the tracing app that they use. And like I said before, it's been found that many of these apps are basically spying on people. The reality is that, we all are so dependent heavily on our smartphones. Our smartphones give away so much information, metadata, even on what we are doing, what our day-to-day activities are. The reality is that if you have a smartphone, then in some way you are probably being tracked. So I think it's a very serious thing for us to think about. There are some practical ways to try to respond to that. And there's lots of really good NGOs and initiatives out there which provide information on how to deal with that. Steve mentioned Citizen Lab. They've done some really great work. There's Frontline Defenders. There's Privacy International. But the reality is the risk is there. And that risk is not going to be going in a very short period of time. The way that we have to deal with that is, I think, thinking about where are the vulnerability points, so that, for example, if it's an autocratic government that's not really liable to succumb to public pressure, who are their business partners? Who are the more democratic states that are doing work with them? We have to be targeting those people. What about the airlines that are, if you're flying on an airline, what are the responsibilities of that airline to protect its customers' human rights? So it's hugely challenging. I don't want to lie about that, but there are things I think that we can do about that. But people should certainly think about that when they're traveling.
Great. Does anybody else want to chime in on that? Yeah, go ahead, Stephen.
Yeah, I with what Mustafa said, I would add that, in some respects, it is the tip of the iceberg in two ways. I mean, one of which is the trend digital, and more everything we do in terms of our interactions and our transactions are going to be digitally oriented. So even if you are able to bring some anonymity in terms of location monitoring, if you now pay for a service with your electronic wallet when you go in a store and you no longer use cash. I mean, every single point along the way, it kind of adds more towards the ability. If governments have the objective and the purpose and the intentionality to track one's whereabouts. But I would also add that in addition to location monitoring, we're seeing a proliferation of other technologies within this ecosystem: facial recognition, other sorts of techniques tied to deep learning, for example. And so the digital trend goes far beyond smartphones. It is extending to a much greater array of technologies, and I think that is worth thinking about as well in terms of the tip of the iceberg observation.
Great. So anybody else want to chime in on that before I jump to the next question?
One very quick thought on the biometric point, which I'm glad you brought up, Steve. I think that's one that really kind of bubbles up from the children's perspective as well, and a really great example of systems that are created for a general public that are pretty fundamentally misaligned with the needs of a children type of user base. It's been shown that many biometric systems just don't work well with children's facial features, and other consideration, which again goes back to this question of, is it better to be invisible? Is it better that those systems don't work well with vulnerable populations like children? But if that data is being used for certain kind of decisions that might negatively impact them, then again, it's I think a little bit more complicated than it's good that they aren't well represented in those systems. I think there's a more complicated kind of question there of, are we using systems that are fundamentally inaccurate in terms of the insights they provide for certain vulnerable publics, using that as the basis for decision making and policy making? Right.
Great. Okay, if nobody else wants to chime in on that, we have a great question from our Facebook Live audience. Over the past year, China, along with other authoritarian countries, have been pushing for a definition of human rights more on safety than on freedom and individual liberties. And I'll tack onto that in some of our interviews with some of the more successful open societies in Asia. They often come to it from a how can we protect our population from natural hazards, and in many ways thinking of COVID-19 as something very similar to a tsunami, right? So how can I use mobile location data for alerting to support safety? And it's more of a focus on safety than freedom. So given kind of global pandemic, has that view spread to other nations? How can we think about that in your experience? I see a couple heads nodding. Did you want to take that, Vani, or? No? Okay, Mustafa? No? Nobody? Oh, go ahead, Mustafa.
Yes, so I mean, it's not a particularly new phenomenon. I haven't seen any data that, I mean, I could be wrong, but that actually directly links the coronavirus situation to that argument of the right to security, basically. So within the human rights architecture at the international level, things like the right to life, the right to security, some of the bedrock principles. You look at the foundation of the United Nations, and the Universal Declaration of 1948 talks about that, and so do a lot of the covenants. So it's actually a very familiar phenomenon of lots of states, and particularly more autocratic states, talking about their obligation to respect the right to security. And so, unsurprisingly, countries like China, Saudi Arabia, they've often spoken about that. And as they have used the national security and emergency lens to respond to Corona, then part of that has also been looking at that. So I think the short answer is yes, but I would also say that's not a particularly new thing. It's an old sort of discussion, and it's also part of that also quite old discussion now of seeking to claim that when citizens seek, civil political rights, the right to speak their mind or to have a certain sexual identity or whatever it might be, that's some sort of Western or it's a foreign concept to us. And so it fits within that situation. What Corona does, I think, and we've seen this in a lot of the research that we've done, for example, in the Gulf, is that states have a ready excuse to basically say, well, it's a safety issue. So it's a huge issue. One final point I'll say is that, many of you will have seen that countries like Saudi Arabia have been on the United Nations Human Rights Council. China gives a lot of money to the United Nations. So does the United Arab Emirates. These are countries which have very poor records on human rights. These countries are not stupid. They have a certain plan in mind in their funding, and that is in part around eroding our understanding of human rights. So it's a very real issue. It's something we have to be very worried about and really push against that.
Yes, Vani.
Mustafa mentioned stupid and it triggered something. Actually, some of them are stupid because it may not be malicious. I returned from the UK on March 13th to India, and 2 days later, I got a number of phone calls asking if I was okay and, if I was infected. And what the state government had done in India had published an Excel sheet, flight details, who came from where, our PIN code, our names, every detail. The first sheet even had the contact, the address, the full address of where we live. Wow. And this wasn't people who were infected. I mean, not that it's all right for people who were infected to be exposed that way, but it was just these Excel sheets put out online because they thought this was a way of, it was just stupidity. I don't think they were being malicious at all. They just put that out there, and then there was a public furor and they took it down. But by then, most people had all the information they needed. So yeah, sometimes I think there's just a knee-jerk reaction and they come up with what they think are solutions that can be quite damaging.
Right. No, that's a great point. Well, if nobody has an answer, wants to answer that question, I've got kind of the flip side to the question, which is, are there any countries we can look to as a model that may have implemented policies regarding new tech for location tracking, for mobile location tech used in contact tracing, et cetera, that can also help safeguard human rights? I think we heard the Norway example where, they've done the analysis and they gave up. Are there places where on the international stage where it's been done right and vulnerable publics' rights have been protected and their well-being has been better served? And sorry, I'm looking for hand. I'm not sure if I just saw Vani's hand. Go ahead, Vani, if I saw Vani's hand. If not, we'll go to Stephen. Go to Stephen.
Yeah, no, I think it's a good question. And, in some ways, to kind of relate it back to the prior question, particularly looking at questions about adding insecurity or safety to the human rights and how that has gained some resonance in the East Asia context, I think actually does present one or two examples of countries that have modeled a much better, more responsible response. So I would look at Taiwan and also South Korea to some extent, both strong democracies that have really put in place responsible practices when it comes to their COVID-19 tracing, have had very effective results because of what they've been able, the protocols that they've been able to implement, and have done so in a very different way than what we've seen in contrast to some of the other countries in the region, particularly China, which has, really been used a very forceful mandatory compliance regime in order to get to try to stem the virus. So there, I would look to that as a contrast, both as a response to the security at all costs, even if you tamp down individual liberties argument that China likes to make, and others like Saudi Arabia, as Mustafa mentioned, like to make in different UN fora, but also just in general as models that we can look to.
Anyone else want to chime in on that? Maybe those are the two. I think, Singapore was brought up also as an exemplar. And I know as we were organizing and doing research and interviewing different folks, it was an interesting kind of world of have and have nots, where they were proactive in the use of the technology. It was used with accountability and openness as it related to Singaporeans, I'd say kind of the mainstream. But then when it dealt with their migrant workers that were in densely packed housing, it was a little later in the game, but you started to see COVID-19 flare-ups in that part of the society. So I think even in a society that's fairly squared away and using these technologies well, you actually, it gives you an interesting lens on kind of what are flaws or chinks in the society's armor and how they may not do things as well as even they thought they did. So I think that becomes an interesting question. Okay, so I've got a few more. I think we can bring this thing in on time, actually. So, technology is often framed as liberating, but each of you have provided examples of technology being used to repress, right? So I want to get the total list out there. We've talked about cell phones. We talked about facial recognition. I heard Vani talk about ID cards. What is the mix of tech that makes up this overall, I don't know, texture, this fabric that we as individuals either have to rely on, to make our lives better, or that we have to be wary of, that it may actually, undermine our well-being. Is there something we haven't covered? Cell phones, facial recognition, ID cards. What else comes to mind for you guys? Any hobby horses? Vani?
In the Gulf, a lot of the companies use fingerprinting to access your workspace and to mark your attendance as well. Private companies. So it's a little.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. Mustafa?
I think one other thing to mention, it sort of has been brought up before as well, is that this whole use of big data to do modeling and machine learning around people's preferences and practices. So you see that a lot with very big companies and even smaller companies to sell us products. But we've seen in our political life, certainly in the UK, I think in the US as well, we had these kind of analytical firms that were selling the data that they got from all sorts of sites to work out political strategies. There's lots of concerns about the advertising and the political content that you might be seeing on your browser is tending to put you into a certain type of category based on your deemed preferences politically or socially. And so I think that is also another thing to look at, that we're in a way being atomized, but also put into these divided categories, which actually makes it harder to reach out to people. So, I mean, in authoritarian societies, there's an element of that as well. You see in some respects less of it because there's less independent political debate. But at the same time, I mean, I read some literature about this. I think it's very hard to get a lot of evidence about it, but it seems to be that these authorities are also doing it on their citizens to really get a sense of what kinds of personality traits they might have, who might be a high risk in terms of being a political activist. And let's face it, there's lots of money to be made. There are people that have often in ex-intelligence service people that are involved in selling their services to these regimes that are looking to track citizens. So yeah, there are, in terms of that tapestry that you talked about, Chris, I think there are efforts to bring that all together, and our regulation on the public level, our ability to capture and to then monitor those things is way behind. And that's really quite troubling.
Great. Yeah, Stephen?
I mean, I in general about the kind of idea liberation technology and whether we've completely lost the the impetus behind that, the rationale behind that. And I struggle a lot myself in terms of kind of grappling with whether we are completely in a new environment of digital repression and whether it's better characterized as a struggle. And I do think it is the latter, that despite everything we've discussed today, and in some ways, I think we're sort of, because of the nature of this panel and the subject matter, we're all sort of focusing on the ways in which this technology is used in exploitative ways and violating ways, particularly against vulnerable publics. But, there are also political truths in terms of how technology has allowed for voices to be heard and political movements to form, particularly lowering the transaction costs for political mobilization that continue to have real effects. At places like Algeria, Sudan, most recently Armenia, a few years ago, and so forth, where you are seeing that the ability of networks to continue to stand and be resilient to authoritarian pressures and to connect people, particularly those of different opposition, orientation, together to organize against autocrats. It continues to be a powerful thing. And I don't think that one aspect will prevail or the other. I think it will continue to be a cat and mouse struggle, and it'll be context specific, and it will depend on the country itself and the ability of activists to be able to use encrypted apps more effectively, Telegram, for example, Signal, and others. So they have to be smart about it, and governments will find ways to exploit vulnerabilities in order to penetrate those. But it's not necessarily a one-sided street at this point. I don't think we're in a total digital repression context where that's the only lens in which to look at that. It's complicated, it's nuanced, but there are opportunities as well. And I don't think we've fully lost the liberation technology idea ethos, even though it's badly damaged, to be honest.
Right. Yeah, Vani, please.
I have a question. Maybe Stephen and Andrew both of you can answer one after the other. So there's a lot of paranoia over technology, right? We feel we are constantly being watched. Last week or the week before, Twitter introduced voice notes, like voice Twitter. And there was this whole explosion of commentary on that saying, because you're going to be masked and facial recognition will not work as well. Now they're trying to mime your voice. Now, how do you kind of differentiate whether this is paranoia and we need to like really stay away, or there is some truth to all these conspiracy theories on what big tech does? And then going back to, a lot of the technology now, it's our children who are introducing us to it. And with online schooling, we don't know if the schools know what they're doing, the educational institutions. Children are spending inordinate hours on it. So I would love to hear from Andrew. I think there was a question even in Q&A on how do we really, negotiate that with our children and make sure that they're safe in terms of the current COVID environment.
Andrew.
An easy one. No, it's a huge and really tricky question, and one that I think is really emerging in real time, because more and more families are being faced with this question of education technology being in their homes day in and day out, and monitoring and kind of back to what I was mentioning at the beginning, quantifying the activities and behaviors of children. And I'm frankly not sure that there is a really clear kind of roadmap to how to mitigate risks that might arise from that. I think one thing that I would encourage, I guess, parents to do in particular is to get in touch with administrators at a school who are leveraging these kind of new technologies and understanding what the agreements put in place entail, what issues like data retention might look like, if at all. If there aren't clear answers or justifiable answers to some of these questions, then I would push back, which I recognize is much easier said than done when talking about a school system interacting with a third-party vendor in many cases. But I think that issue of what is in those agreements, what kind of information is being quantified and passed between parties, and how long is that information being held is really unclear at the current moment as it relates to EdTech, and especially as more and more kind of entrants are moving into the space due to the absolutely exploding need for those kind of services. So that's one. And I think generally being conscious of putting children's information online in general terms is something that's really important, whether it's images that could eventually feed into facial recognition algorithms, information on behavior and movement patterns. All of that information needs to be considered, I think, really closely, and again, kind of whether there's a clear value to be created from generating or sharing that kind of data, because as I kind of mentioned at the beginning, children are being quantified for their entire lives. And as more and more data points and data streams are created, it only leads to more questions about what future data could be linked to those existing data sets to create new sensitivities or risks that we aren't even in a position to anticipate at this point.
Right. If there's not another response to that, I don't want to cut anybody off, but we have a few more questions I'd love to get out there. Vani, you actually talked about, there is this data that is kind of being used tactically in positive ways to prevent trafficking or to help rescue people from abuse, et cetera. But where can one find, it's kind of a different set of data, or maybe one feeds into the other. Where can one find reputable mapping data, spatial temporal data regarding the rise of abuse, trafficking in countries during COVID or between countries during COVID? And are there links to best practice one can use to kind of use an outreach to inform and to raise awareness? I assume, go over to Vani first, or yeah, go ahead, Vani.
So on our website, migrantrights.org, you will see a map. We map these map abuses, and we mine data from media, from what's reported to us. And so you will get a view of what kind of abuses, so the category of abuses, which countries, how often, how many people affected. It's not up to date because it's very time intensive. That's the only way we can get data in the Gulf, because they're very guarded about the data. It's not disaggregated. Even the countries that provide data will not give you nationality-wise breakdowns. And we try to provide that. In terms of carrying data over to countries of origin, there was a question regarding that. It is a concern now because we don't know how much information is being exchanged between countries in terms of people being repatriated, people being sent back. So they are undergoing 2 sets of tests, but we don't know what other information is being exchanged. So I'm not clear about that. But in terms of mapping of these abuses, there's something on our website that you can check out.
Great. Does anybody else want to chime in on that? Okay. So I've got 2 more questions before we wrap up, and I think they're both kind of important and a little bit stark. One is from someone tuned in from Brazil, is very focused on it's easy to talk about all this, the negative implications of all this tech, but there's some places that don't have the tech, right? And it's more of a decision of trying to get goodness, get the tech deployed so that people can benefit from it in a kind of more basic way. And some people, sometimes we may call that, like, we're talking about rich people problems here, even though we know we're not. So does anybody want to talk about that dilemma that we have, where we're actually trying to get these technologies in people's hands to improve their lot in life, but then by putting it in their hands, they become kind of targets in this larger set of issues? Does anybody want to just kind of chime in on that? Yeah, Stephen.
It's a great dilemma. I mean, it's a great point. It's a huge dilemma, and I can think of a number of countries where that issue of, on the one hand, trying to bring about tech for good, find ways to use technology to improve economic potential, livelihoods, is a real thing. I mean, I can, a couple countries that come to mind where I've spent significant time. Rwanda is a good case in point. Ethiopia as well. That's where you have a real push by the government on the one hand, which has led to sustained economic development to bring in greater internet connectivity, to build tech sector, to support startups and so forth. But you also have 2 regimes, Rwanda in particular, that are extremely authoritarian, that have undertaken documented human rights violations and that brook very little dissent. So how do you bring those 2 strands together? What's the balance between, on the one hand, saying, look, people need to find the economic rights of citizens is important, but the political rights on the one hand are suffering because of this emphasis on the economic side. I can the dilemma. I don't have good answers for that, other than to say that the work is hard and must continue to push on the political side as well, and that individuals shouldn't be denied the ability to access this technology simply because their governments will exploit it for political objectives. That we need to find a way to thread the needle and do both. And it's incumbent upon all of us to be creative about that and work with the technologies to build and put in place the right safeguards. So it at least is harder, that there's more friction when it comes to governments trying to do bad things with these types of instruments, these tools.
That's great. Unless somebody else wants to chime in on that, I got one last. Go ahead, Vani.
So female domestic workers in the Gulf are highly isolated. They live within households and they don't have contact with anyone else. And when they're abused, they're not able to file a complaint. So in fact, Saudi Arabia, in its recent bilateral agreements with sending countries, has made a point that every female live-in domestic worker should be given a phone and SIM card because they recognize that that might break their isolation. Qatar, for instance, now through their visa centers, pre-departure, the workers get a phone number, which they can, once they land, they're able to get the SIM card. So there are these things where, in terms of just breaking isolation, there are some moves being made to ensure workers have access to communication. It's too early to say how it's being implemented and how it might be exploited.
Well, that's a great point. And I'm actually going to use that to bonus into my last question, because the last question we've heard a lot of negative things, right? Because there's a lot of bad things happening to vulnerable populations around the world. And frankly, I think they're going to educate our larger debate as we hold more blue ribbon panels on this topic into the future. But what does good look like? Right? Vani just gave us a great example of, a couple pieces of progress. What does good look like? Like, what are the handful of things that you think are reasonable, that could be done, that are being done or in the works, that could improve the lot of vulnerable publics with using mobile location tech in an era of COVID-19 and beyond? Anybody? Any good signs out there? Wow, deafening silence. Okay, go ahead, Mustafa.
That they are necessarily a sweeping array of solutions, but I think there's a couple of things that we can look at. I mean, in the EU, you have the GDPR, which are basically the data protection regulations. You have them in the UK, and a lot of developed countries have them too. I mean, it's actually quite a useful guideline for the kinds of steps you can take from start to finish in terms of, someone simply going to a website, if you're handling data. Lots of countries have information commissioners that also provide lots of really useful information. Now, we often balk at these things. We think of this as bureaucracy, but in fact, if you were to, implement those requirements, I mean, even in my own organization, because we handle so much data, a lot of our work is around that regulation, and we find that very useful. I think one of the key things is, number one, consultation. You need to consult with the people that your technology is seeking to monitor or even assist them. You need to ask them, what are their needs? Do they understand what we will be doing with their information? That's one thing. The second thing is, and I know I'm being very broad, I can give specific examples, but the second thing is accountability. The person that is capturing the data, person, metaphorically speaking, it could be an institution or a number of different actors, what's the accountability over that person? For example, if the Norway authorities, even in Norway, as Mark and others mentioned, are at a point where they're realizing, this is just too much power for us to have, we have to turn off the switch. That you have to have that as well. People realizing that there are limits to what they can achieve. But if you don't have those two things, consulting with, and in human rights, we call that the rights holder, the person on the one hand. On the other hand, you don't have accountability mechanisms for us to monitor the monitors, then you are going to face all sorts of issues. So I think those are really key things, and they're positives. And you see there are technologies out there that have made doing our work and expressing our human rights easier than before, like some people mentioned with things like Signal, WhatsApp and other ways that in fact that technology has liberated us. I mean, in a way that, my organization, the majority of my team are low-wage migrant workers in places like the Gulf. That work would not be possible to be done safely without those technologies. So yeah, we can't forget that either.
Great. Who else wants to go on the lightning round? Stephen.
Building off of Mustafa's point, I think technology also has the ability to give power to individuals and to hold governments accountable, and that location monitoring in particular can play a really important role in ensuring that there's accuracy when it comes to charges that activists or others or citizens would allege against the government for certain abuses. I can think of things like George Floyd. I can look at situations like the massacres that took place by security forces in Sudan and Iran last year, even under the cover of an internet shutdown that later on, because of documentation that took place from mobile phones that were time-stamped with specific dates and locations, were able to kind of verify atrocities that took place. And in the case of Sudan, led to a groundswell that actually upended the existing regime. So, and certainly you look at the Hong Kong protests and the ways that activists were able to organize into specifically Spotlight, where police forces were massing in order to avoid, violence in particular sections of the city. I mean, there are many ways where when activists and individuals are empowered by this technology, they can really use it to good effect. So I do think there are many positive examples of holding to account those who are in power, particularly autocratic regimes, where this technology can have a lot of use.
Before I wind us down. Okay, well, out of respect for everybody's time, and in particular, our panelists who have just given us 3 hours of their lives and their insights, I'd like to say thank you. Before I go through all my thank yous, I'd like to point out that this is the first in a series of blue ribbon panels. We thought it was important to start with these world international perspectives on vulnerable publics. Next week, we will actually have what we call a leader spotlight with former UN Ambassador Samantha Power. We will then reprise the discussion on vulnerable publics, focused on the US context specifically, and then bringing in a series of national security leaders, former deputy director of the NSA, the former principal deputy DNI, briefers of the President of the United States, former director of the Defense Intelligence Agency, folks that have been in the business of surveillance for a very long time in the context of American democracy, and opportunities to learn from them. So we have an exciting set of panels. It won't just be these three, it'll be going all summer long. So we encourage you to tune in. Next slide. But I would like to thank all of our panelists. Mark, Steve, Mustafa, Vani, Andrew, thank you so much for sharing your insights with our community here. To point out to everyone that these will be videotaped sessions. No one has a videotape. These will be recorded sessions. They'll be available on the internet for all to see. And thank you especially to the Henry Luce Foundation for their sponsorship of this important dialogue. So please stay tuned for these future panels. Visit our website at ethicalgeo.org for updates, and share your thoughts on this discussion at #LocationTechTaskForce on Twitter and on Facebook. So thanks to all of you, and take care, be safe and healthy. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you so much,
Thanks,
everyone.
everyone.
Have a great weekend.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you all.
You too.